In July afternoon in 2019, the facade of suburban bliss was shattered in a way that would haunt the community for years to come. At the center of this tragedy were the Hendersons. Thaddeus, a 45-year-old investment banker with a reputation for his work ethic and community involvement, and his wife Margot, a 43-year-old part-time yoga instructor known for her vibrant personality and infectious laugh. They had been fixtures in the community for over a decade. Their seemingly perfect marriage, the envy of many. Next door lived the Coopers. Elaine, a widow, and her 19-year-old son, Liam, a college sophomore, home for the summer. The Coopers had moved in 5 years ago, and while they kept to themselves more than most, they were generally well liked by their neighbors. No one could have predicted that these ordinary lives would collide in such a catastrophic way. Thaddeus Henderson had always been driven by ambition. Born to working-class parents in rural Iowa, he had clawed his way up the social ladder through sheer determination and an almost obsessive work ethic. By his early 30s, he had established himself as a rising star at a financial company. His colleagues admired his sharp analytical mind, and his clients appreciated his no-nonsense approach to wealth management. Margot Sinclair, as she was known before her marriage, had a different trajectory. The daughter of a college professor and an artist, she grew up in a household that valued creativity and self-expression. She studied modern dance at the university, dreaming of a career on stage. However, a knee injury in her senior year derailed those plans, leading her to pivot towards yoga and wellness coaching. Their paths crossed at a charity gala in 2003. Thaddeus, already successful but lacking in social graces, was immediately drawn to Margot's vivacity and charm. For Margot, Thaddeus represented stability and the promise of a comfortable life that would allow her to pursue her passions without financial worry. They married a year later in a lavish ceremony that was the talk of their social circle. The early years of their marriage were happy ones. Thaddeus' career continued to flourish, and he took pride in providing Margot with the life he felt she deserved. Margot, for her part, threw herself into being the perfect corporate wife, hosting dinner parties and attending social events that were crucial for Thaddeus' networking. She also began teaching yoga part-time at an upscale studio, finding fulfillment, and helping others achieve balance and inner peace. But as the years wore on, cracks began to appear in their carefully constructed life. Thaddeus' work hours grew longer, his ambition pushing him to chase ever bigger deals and clients. He was rarely home before 9 p.m., and even when he was physically present, his mind was often elsewhere, constantly checking his phone for emails or market updates. Margot, approaching her 40s, found herself increasingly restless. The yoga classes and charity committees that once filled her days now felt hollow. She began to question the choices that had led her to this point, wondering if she had traded her dreams for a gilded cage. The couple's failure to conceive, despite years of trying, added another layer of strain to their relationship. By the summer of 2019, the Hendersons' marriage was a carefully maintained facade. To the outside world, they still appeared to be the golden couple. Thaddeus continued to excel at work, recently closing a deal that put him in line for a partnership. Margot's yoga classes were more popular than ever, her students drawn to her warmth and apparent serenity. But behind closed doors, they were virtual strangers. Conversations, when they happened, were perfunctory and centered around schedules and social obligations. Physical intimacy had become a rare occurrence, each touch laden with unspoken resentments and unfulfilled expectations. Neither Thaddeus nor Margot was willing to admit, even to themselves, how far they had drifted apart. It was easier to maintain the illusion, to go through the motions of a happy marriage, than to confront the emptiness that had grown between them. Little did they know that this unacknowledged chasm in their relationship was about to become the catalyst for a tragedy that would shatter not just their lives, but the entire community of Riverside. The Coopers had moved into the house next door to the Hendersons in 2014. Following the death of Elaine Cooper's husband, Dr. Reginald Cooper, a respected oncologist, Reginald had succumbed to the very disease he had spent his life fighting, leaving Elaine to raise their son Liam alone. Elaine, a soft-spoken librarian, had initially struggled to adjust to life in the new community. The move from their modest home in St. Paul had been necessary to escape the memories that haunted every corner of their old house, but the affluent suburb felt alien to her. She found solace in her books and in tending to the garden that soon became the envy of the neighborhood. Liam Cooper was 14 when they moved in, a lanky, introverted teenager more comfortable with computers than with people. The transition to a new school had been difficult, and he often found himself the target of bullies who mocked his second-hand clothes and quiet demeanor. It was during this time that Thaddeus Henderson had taken Liam under his wing, offering him a job mowing lawns and doing odd jobs around the neighborhood. Over the next 5 years, Liam had blossomed. The awkward teen grew into a handsome young man, his natural intelligence finally finding an outlet in his computer science studies at the university. Despite his growing confidence, Liam remained devoted to his mother. He worried about her isolation and loneliness and made a point of coming home most weekends, even when his friends were planning parties or road trips. It was on one of these weekend visits in early June that he first encountered Margot Henderson in a new light. Elaine had always been grateful for the Hendersons' kindness, particularly Margot's efforts to include her in neighborhood activities. She often spoke of Margot's generosity, unaware of the complex emotions brewing beneath the surface of her son's polite nods. The spark that ignited the affair between Margot Henderson and Liam Cooper was as unexpected as it was intense. It happened on a balmy evening in early June, during one of the Hendersons' legendary summer barbecues. Thaddeus, as usual, was holding court near the grill, regaling his colleagues with tales of his latest financial coup. Margot, feeling particularly isolated amidst the crowd, had retreated to the relative quiet of the pool house to replenish the ice bucket. Liam, who had been reluctantly dragged to the party by his mother, chose that moment to seek refuge from the noise and forced socializing. He entered the pool house not realizing it was occupied and found Margot struggling with a large bag of ice. Their eyes met and in that instant something shifted. He moved to help her with the ice, their hands brushing. They stood there, momentarily frozen, the cold of the ice contrasting sharply with the heat building between them. It was Margot who broke the silence, her voice husky as she thanked him. Liam, usually so articulate, found himself stammering in response. That brief encounter set the stage for what was to come. Over the next few weeks, Margot and Liam found themselves manufacturing reasons to be in each other's company. It started innocently enough. Margot asking Liam for help with her laptop, Liam offering to help in her garden. Each interaction was charged with an undercurrent of attraction that they both tried to ignore. Their first kiss happened almost a month after the barbecue. Liam had been helping Margot set up for one of her yoga classes in the park. As they finished, a sudden summer storm broke out. They ran for shelter under a nearby gazebo, laughing and breathless. As the rain poured down around them, Margot looked at Liam and felt a surge of desire she hadn't experienced in years. Before she could think better of it, she leaned in and kissed him. From that point, their affair escalated quickly. They were reckless, driven by a combination of Liam's youthful passion and Margot's desperation to feel alive again. They met in secluded spots around town, in the back row of the local cinema, in a hidden corner of the public library, and most dangerously, in the Henderson home when Thaddeus was at work. Each encounter left them craving more, the gulf in their ages forgotten in the heat of their stolen moments. Margot felt rejuvenated, rediscovering parts of herself she thought long lost. Liam, for his part, was intoxicated by Margot's experience and the taboo nature of their relationship. But as the summer wore on, the strain of maintaining their secret began to show. Close calls became more frequent, a neighbor almost catching them in an embrace, a suspicious glance from Elaine when Margot's name came up too often in conversation. The guilt too started to weigh on them both. Liam struggled with the knowledge that he was betraying Thaddeus, a man who had been nothing but kind to him. Margot found herself lying more and more to her husband, each deception another crack in the foundation of her marriage. Yet despite the risks and the guilt, neither seemed able to end the affair. They were caught in a whirlwind of passion and need, blind to the devastating consequences that loomed on the horizon. July 15, 2019 dawned hot and humid, the air heavy with the promise of an approaching storm. It was a Monday, and Riverside stirred to life as its residents prepared for another week of work and routine. For Thaddeus Henderson, it began like any other day. He rose early, donned one of his impeccably tailored suits, and left for the office before Margot had even stirred from sleep. Margot woke later, her mind already racing with plans for the day ahead. Thaddeus had informed her the night before that he would be working late. A crucial client dinner that could seal his partnership deal. For Margot, this meant an opportunity. She sent a text to Liam, her heart racing as she suggested he come over in the afternoon. Liam, who had been agonizing over the affair for days, saw the message as a chance to end things face to face. He replied with a simple, okay, resolving to break it off before the situation spiraled further out of control. The day passed slowly for both of them. Margot went through the motions of her morning yoga class, her usual serenity replaced by a nervous energy that her students couldn't help but notice. Liam, at his summer job, found it hard to focus on the lines of code on his screen, his mind constantly drifting to thoughts of Margot and the conversation to come. At 2:30 p.m., Liam made his way next door, glancing furtively around to ensure none of the neighbors were watching. Margot ushered him in quickly, her face flushed with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. It was Liam who broke the silence, starting to say that they needed to talk. But Margot, misreading his intention and driven by a desperate need to feel desired, cut him off with a passionate kiss. Despite his reservations, Liam found himself responding, his resolve weakening in the face of Margot's intensity. What happened next was a blur of discarded clothes and tangled limbs as they made their way to the master bedroom. All thoughts of ending the affair were temporarily forgotten as they lost themselves in each other. Meanwhile, across town, Thaddeus Henderson sat in his office frowning at his computer screen. The numbers for the client presentation weren't adding up, and he knew he'd have to redo a significant portion of his work. Frustration mounting, he made a snap decision. He would go home, regroup and return to the office later to finish up before the dinner. At 3:45 p.m., Thaddeus's car pulled into the driveway. He noticed Liam Cooper's beat-up Honda parked a little way down the street, but thought nothing of it, probably helping Elaine with some errand. He mused as he unlocked the front door. The house was quiet as Thaddeus entered, but something felt off. A half-empty glass of wine sat on the coffee table, unusual for Margot at this hour. Then he heard it, a muffled sound coming from upstairs. Frowning, he climbed the stairs, the noise growing louder as he approached the master bedroom. What Thaddeus saw when he opened the door would be forever seared into his memory. His wife, the woman he had loved for 15 years, was in their bed with Liam Cooper, the 19-year-old guy he had mentored and trusted. Then with a roar of rage and pain, Thaddeus lunged forward. His hands, so used to manipulating numbers and shaking on business deals, now curled into fists as he grabbed Liam, yanking him off the bed. Margot screamed, scrambling to cover herself and separate the two men, but her efforts were in vain. Thaddeus's first punch caught Liam squarely in the jaw, sending the younger man stumbling backward. But Liam, driven by adrenaline and fear, fought back. The two men grappled, crashing into the dresser, sending framed photos and trinkets scattering across the floor. In the chaos, no one noticed the heavy crystal bookend that fell from the dresser's top. No one saw it until Thaddeus, in a fit of blind rage, grabbed it and brought it down on Liam's head with a sickening thud. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. Liam crumpled to the floor, blood pooling rapidly around his motionless form. Margot's scream pierced the air as the full horror of what had just transpired hit them all. In that moment, as storm clouds gathered outside and sirens wailed in the distance, the lives of everyone involved changed irrevocably. The idyllic facade of Riverside had been shattered, and nothing would ever be the same again. The piercing wail of police sirens shattered the usual tranquility of the community. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains, curiosity mingling with apprehension, as squad cars and an ambulance screeched to a halt in front of the Henderson residence. The first officers on the scene were met with a tableau of horror that would haunt them for years to come. Inside, they found a shell-shocked Thaddeus Henderson, his hands covered in blood, sitting on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. Margot barely clothed and hysterical. The room bore all the hallmarks of a violent struggle. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, and smears of blood on the hardwood floor. Detective Ava Rossi, a veteran of the police department's homicide unit, took charge of the scene. Her first priority was securing medical attention for Liam Cooper. As paramedics worked feverishly to stabilize him, Rossi began the delicate process of piecing together the events that had led to this tragedy. Thaddeus, still in a state of shock, was taken into custody without resistance. Margot was separately questioned, Their stories, fragmented and emotional, painted a picture of a long-simmering marital discord that had exploded into violence. As word spread through the neighborhood, a crowd began to gather at the police cordon. Among them was Elaine Cooper, who collapsed in grief when informed of her son's critical condition. She was quickly whisked away to the hospital, where Liam was fighting for his life in the intensive care unit. The investigation moved quickly. Forensics teams combed through the Henderson home, collecting evidence and taking photographs. The crystal bookend, now a potential murder weapon, was carefully bagged and tagged. Neighbors were interviewed, their statements adding context to the relationships between the Hendersons and the Coopers. One neighbor recalled hearing raised voices from the Henderson house earlier that afternoon, but had dismissed it as a television playing too loudly. Another mentioned seeing Liam enter the Henderson home around 2:30 p.m., noting it because he thought it odd given Thaddeus's usual work schedule. As night fell, the gravity of the situation became clear. Liam Cooper was pronounced dead at 9:47 p.m., never having regained consciousness. The charge against Thaddeus Henderson was elevated from assault to second-degree murder. In the days that followed, more details emerged. Margot, racked with guilt and facing intense scrutiny, admitted to the affair with Liam. Her statement, given through tears at the police station, provided a timeline of their relationship and the events leading up to that fateful afternoon. Thaddeus, advised by his hastily retained attorney, remained silent. But his colleagues at the company painted a picture of a man under immense pressure, working long hours in pursuit of a partnership that had seemed within reach. None, however, had suspected the depth of his marital problems or the capacity for violence that had been unleashed. The case against Thaddeus Henderson was building, but Rossi knew that in the court of public opinion, there would be no clear villains or heroes in this story. Only victims, each in their own way of the secrets and lies that had finally come to light in the most devastating manner possible. No one has ever expected the plot twist that's about to come, and twist that will shock everyone, including the Hendersons. The Henderson trial began on a crisp autumn morning, 6 months after the events that had shaken Riverside to its core. The county courthouse, a stately building of red brick and white columns, was surrounded by reporters and curious onlookers. Inside, the tension was palpable as the judge called the court to order. Prosecuting attorney Veronica Talbot, known for her sharp mind and even sharper tongue, laid out the state's case in her opening statement. She painted a vivid picture of Thaddeus Henderson as a man consumed by rage and jealousy, who had brutally murdered a young man in the prime of his life. Talbot's words were measured but impactful, her gaze sweeping across the jury as she promised to prove Henderson's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Defense attorney countered with a narrative of his own. He portrayed Thaddeus as a devoted husband and pillar of the community, pushed to the brink by a betrayal of the deepest kind. Sterling suggested that the death was a tragic accident, the result of a confrontation that had spiraled out of control. As the trial progressed, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Forensic experts testified about blood spatter patterns and the force required to cause Liam's fatal injury. Neighbors recounted the events of that day, and character witnesses spoke to the personalities and reputations of both Thaddeus and Liam. But it was Margot Henderson's testimony that captivated the courtroom. Over 2 grueling days on the stand, she laid bare the disintegration of her marriage and the evolution of her relationship with Liam. Her voice trembled as she described the moment Thaddeus had walked in on them, and the horror of watching the confrontation unfold. Under cross-examination, Sterling tried to paint her as an unfaithful wife whose actions had driven her husband to temporary insanity. But Margot held firm, accepting her part in the tragedy while insisting that nothing justified Liam's death. Elaine Cooper's testimony was brief but powerful. Still grief-stricken, she spoke of her son's kindness and his dreams for the future, all cut short in an act of violence. Her quiet dignity in the face of unimaginable loss moved many in the courtroom to tears. As the trial neared its end, all eyes turned to Thaddeus Henderson. Against his lawyer's advice, he chose to take the stand. His testimony was a study in contrasts, moments of apparent remorse interspersed with flashes of the anger that had led to Liam's death. He spoke of the pressure he'd been under at work, the growing distance in his marriage, and the shock of discovering his wife's infidelity. When describing the fight with Liam, Thaddeus claimed he had never intended to cause serious harm, that he had simply lost control. As the trial progressed, expert witnesses from the field of psychology were called to provide insight into the minds of those involved in the tragic events. Dr. Cho explained that Thaddeus's actions could be understood through the lens of what psychologists call intermittent explosive disorder, characterized by episodes of violent, aggressive behavior disproportionate to the situation. She pointed to Thaddeus's high-stress job, his unexpressed marital dissatisfaction, and the shock of discovering his wife's infidelity as contributing factors to his violent outburst. However, under cross-examination, Dr. Cho conceded that while these factors could explain Thaddeus's behavior, they did not excuse it. She emphasized that many individuals face similar stressors without resorting to violence. The defense called a specialist in marriage and family therapy to testify about the psychological impact of infidelity. Friedman described the profound sense of betrayal and loss of identity that a person may experience upon discovering a spouse's affair. He likened it to a form of psychological trauma, capable of triggering extreme emotional responses. The psychological analyses presented during the trial offered a complex picture of human behavior and motivation. They highlighted how a combination of personal history, societal expectations, and immediate circumstances can collide to create a perfect storm of tragedy. After 7 grueling weeks of testimony, evidence presentation, and legal arguments, the fate of Thaddeus Henderson rested in the hands of the jury. As Judge Blackwell sent the 12 men and women to deliberate, a tense silence fell over the courtroom. After a short recess to consider all factors, Judge Blackwell returned to deliver her sentence. Citing the violent nature of the crime balanced against Thaddeus's lack of prior criminal history and the unique circumstances of the case, she sentenced him to 18 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 12 years. As Thaddeus was led away in handcuffs, the full weight of the tragedy seemed to descend upon the courtroom. There were no victors here, only lives irrevocably altered by a moment of passion and a split second of violence. Outside, as news of the verdict spread, the crowd's reactions were mixed. Some felt justice had been served, while others argued the sentence was too harsh or too lenient. But all agreed on one thing: the events that had unfolded in Riverside would leave an indelible mark on the community for years to come. Today we'll delve into the case of a 17-year-old girl who stepped out of the cafe where she worked weekends and vanished without a trace. Police began finding one disturbing clue after another, suggesting something truly awful had happened to this girl. From the beginning, this case became Sweden's top news story, drawing in over 1,000 people for the largest search operation in the country's history. In the end, they managed to uncover the grim truth, leaving everyone stunned at how such a tragedy could have happened. Lisa Holm was born on February 7, 1998, in the small Swedish town of Hovda. It was a quiet and peaceful place where she lived with her parents and older sister. Lisa was a kind, positive, and determined person. Even before finishing school, she decided she wanted to go to Australia and study architecture. Lisa also traveled a lot with her parents, seeing a lot of other countries. She was also quite independent. Since her teenage years, Lisa had been working at various part-time jobs to earn some money on her own. Before the summer of 2015, when Lisa was 17, she finally got her first serious job at a cafe about a 40-minute drive from her home. For the first few weeks, her parents drove her there, but soon her father decided to buy her a scooter. Lisa had a license for this type of transport, while she could only get a car license after turning 18. She was happy with this gift because she wanted to commute to work on her own. But for the first few weeks, her father accompanied her in his car, since Lisa had almost no experience driving on the roads. She only worked weekends and her father accompanied her every morning and evening. This went on until June 7th, when he finally let her drive to the cafe alone. Somewhere around lunchtime, her parents decided to visit her at work and have lunch together. That day the cafe was pretty crowded, so Lisa was really busy with work. She took a short break for lunch, had a snack with her parents, and they went back home. At 6:23, Lisa texted her father that she was leaving work. But 3 minutes later he received a call from her. He picked up, but no one answered. He heard some voices in the background and thought Lisa had dialed his number accidentally. The father thought she was talking to her colleagues and also heard the sound of a car door slamming shut. He called Lisa's name several times with no answer. then ended the call and began waiting for her to get home. But she didn't show up. An hour passed and Lisa's parents started to worry. She should have arrived by now, so her father immediately thought something might have happened to her on the way. It was her first time riding alone on the scooter, and he was deeply concerned about her safety. He tried calling her several times, but Lisa's phone was off. After waiting a few more minutes, her father decided to hit the road, hoping to meet her along the way, since Lisa should have taken the shortest route. The father feared Lisa might have had an accident, so he drove at a slow pace, scanning the road. But Lisa was nowhere to be found. The man eventually reached the cafe without finding his daughter. Upon arriving at her workplace, he noticed Lisa's scooter parked in front of the building. By that moment, the man was already in a state of panic, having been unable to find his daughter throughout the entire way. Seeing her scooter, he immediately calmed down, thinking that for some reason she was delayed at work. However, there was no one in the cafe, and the man noticed something else. Lisa's scooter keys were left in the ignition, with a helmet hanging from its handle. All of this led him to believe that something bad had happened to his daughter. She would have never left the keys in the scooter, abandoning it in the parking lot unattended. Meanwhile, Lisa's mother called the cafe owner in hopes of shedding light on her daughter's whereabouts. But the woman claimed to have no idea where she could have gone. She had called her employees around 6 p.m., and they said they were closing the cafe. After the call from Lisa's mother, the cafe owner immediately got into her car and headed there. On the way, she called 4 of her friends who lived nearby, and asked them to help with the search. When the cafe owner arrived at the scene, they, along with Lisa's father, began searching both the establishment itself and the surrounding area. Their last hope was that Lisa, for some reason, might have decided to take a bus instead of the scooter. They checked the schedule and her mother, along with Lisa's older sister, drove to the bus stop in their town. Unfortunately, this version was not confirmed. Lisa was not on the bus, so her relatives immediately contacted the police. By that time it was almost 10 p.m., and it already got dark outside. The police immediately launched extensive searches. The fact that Lisa's scooter was left in the parking lot with the keys led them to consider the possibility of abduction. Cases like this are quite rare in Sweden, especially in the remote provincial area where Lisa's town was located. Therefore, police immediately dispatched several groups with search dogs, while other officers began knocking on every house located near the cafe. When Lisa's classmates and her friends learned about her disappearance, they began spreading information about it on social media, hoping to attract more attention and possibly find some witnesses. The search continued all night, but it yielded no results. On Monday morning, the police department announced Lisa's disappearance to the public, urging anyone who has some useful information to come forward. Around the same time, a man who came to work at a barn right across the cafe discovered a motorcycle glove on the floor and reported it to the police. Detectives had already inspected this barn on the evening of Lisa's disappearance, but they hadn't noticed the glove there. They showed it to Lisa's parents, who confirmed that the glove indeed belonged to their daughter. This further supported the abduction theory, and the police deployed additional resources for the search. By that time, news of Lisa's disappearance had spread throughout the country, and hundreds of volunteers joined the search. On Tuesday, police received several more alarming clues. Volunteers searched the area along the dirt road located a few hundred yards from the cafe. There they found a phone case, a receipt, a ticket, and a broken smartphone screen. Investigators immediately determined that all these items belonged to Lisa, and focused the search in that area. Soon they found other parts of the broken smartphone, Lisa's ID, and several more receipts. All these items were scattered along the same dirt road. After the discovery of those pieces of evidence, the police became almost certain that Lisa had become a victim of abduction. They threw all available resources into the search, and with each passing day, more and more people joined in. This case became the main news topic in Sweden, and hundreds of volunteers flocked from all over the country to participate in the search. A local volunteer organization specializing in finding missing people also joined the effort. All of this made Lisa's search operation the largest in the country's modern history, with over 1,000 people participating in total. The police also received numerous calls with tips. One woman recounted that she went for a jog the day before Lisa's disappearance. At some point, a man who stood next to his car stopped her in the middle of the road. He spoke to her in English and asked for directions to a city she had never heard of. She tried to show him the way on Google Maps, but the man asked her to get into his car and show the route on his navigator. Naturally, the woman found this request quite suspicious, so she refused and continued running. She also shared one interesting detail with the police. The woman believed she had already seen this man among the workers who were repairing the same barn located across the road from the cafe. Lisa's colleagues also shared one observation. On the day of her disappearance, one of the witnesses noticed two men standing across the road from the cafe, looking towards the establishment. She didn't think of it much at the time, but after Lisa's disappearance, she decided to share this fact with the police. The next morning on Wednesday, Lisa's father, along with some friends, went to search the dirt road where her belongings were found. Walking a bit further, he made several more alarming discoveries. He found Lisa's driver's license and her house keys. It all seemed as if Lisa was being taken along this road away from the cafe, while the abductor was throwing her belongings out of their car or other vehicle they used to kidnap her. The police and volunteers concentrated all their efforts on this area, but no other items were found. That same evening, a friend of Lisa's father was returning home from the search. Passing by the cafe, he noticed that the police tape had been removed from the barn where Lisa's glove was found. The man decided to go inside and look for any other clues once more. He grabbed a flashlight from his car, as it was already getting dark outside, and walked around the premises for several minutes until something shiny on the floor caught his attention. When he looked closer, he saw a woman's earring and another one just like it nearby. The man reported this to the police, who showed the earrings to Lisa's parents. They confirmed that these pieces of jewelry belonged to their daughter. The police once again sealed off the barn and searched it more thoroughly. The lead detective later explained that on the first day of Lisa's search, their main focus was on finding the girl herself, so the barn was inspected not so thoroughly. They might have missed such small items as earrings, but now they brought in numerous forensic experts along with search dogs. This time they noticed a rather unusual piece of evidence. Behind one of the walls, the police found human feces. At first glance, it may seem unrelated to the case, but the forensic experts put forward an interesting theory. They explained that when criminals commit serious and horrible crimes, their body produces an extreme amount of adrenaline, which sometimes leads to the uncontrollable need to relieve themselves. For example, it's common for killers to wet themselves before or during the murder. Considering that Lisa's glove and earrings were found in the barn, the police theorized that if she was indeed abducted, the perpetrator might have dragged her into this building. Therefore, detectives didn't rule out the possibility that this person, under the influence of adrenaline, couldn't hold it and relieve themselves, so these feces were sent to DNA analysis. On Friday, the search area was expanded and volunteers reached a farm located about 2 miles from the cafe. It was a complex of several large buildings where many people worked, and the search team decided to inspect them all. However, shortly after they arrived, 2 men came to the farm. They didn't speak Swedish and communicated only in English. One of them said that the police had already been at this farm, but the search team leader didn't rush to believe it. He thought that he would have known about it if that were the case, so he decided to continue the search. The 2 men walked around the farm for a while, watching the volunteers, and eventually drove away. About an hour later, members of the search team found a pile of branches behind the cowshed. Under it, they found a motorcycle helmet, jacket, and headphones. The police immediately arrived at the scene and confirmed that all these items belonged to Lisa. They sent forensic experts to the farm for a more thorough search. Detectives also heard the story about the 2 strange men who tried to dissuade the volunteers from inspecting the farm. The police also recalled the story of a woman who encountered a suspicious man speaking English while jogging. In fact, they already had an idea who it might be. From the first days of the search, they had visited all the houses near the cafe, and in one of them lived 2 brothers from Lithuania, along with the wife of one of them. All 3 didn't speak Swedish and communicated in English. They were the only people within several miles who didn't speak the local language. The police also had other indirect reasons to suspect them. The brothers worked in the barn across the road from the cafe, and at the farm where Lisa's helmet was found. They were familiar with these locations, and the dirt road where Lisa's belongings were found led to their house. Considering that there were no other suspects, The police decided to question all three of them. Meanwhile, forensic experts arrived at the farm. Together with the volunteers, they continued to inspect this area, and soon their attention was drawn to an old trailer. It was surrounded by tall grass and looked as if it hadn't been used in many years. But next to its door, the grass was flattened, as if something had been lying there recently. Some of the grass was also trapped under the door, indicating that it had been recently opened. As soon as the forensic experts opened the door, they were immediately met with a strong smell of decay. Inside the trailer there were many lockers for clothing. Apparently, it was once used as a changing room for workers. All the lockers except one were locked, leading the experts to suspect that Lisa's body might be in one of them. They began opening each locker, and eventually saw that Lisa's body was actually in one that was left open, hidden behind a pile of old clothes and rags. Despite the small size of the locker, the perpetrator managed to fit their victim inside. Lisa had a rope around her neck and a large amount of tape over her head. Her pants were pulled down and her shirt was pulled up. Medical experts determined that Lisa died from strangulation. However, they found no signs of sexual assault. All of her clothing was handed over to the lab, while news of the discovery of her body rapidly spread throughout the country. All this time, the news of Lisa's abduction dominated headlines in Sweden. When her body was found and the public learned of Lisa's brutal murder, the case shook the entire country. Such crimes were extremely rare in Sweden, and people were shocked that someone could commit such a heinous act. On the same day that her body was discovered, something unusual and rather eerie occurred. YouTube users stumbled upon a video posted 13 days before the murder. The video was titled 13, and it featured a countdown timer. What was most unsettling was the name of the channel that uploaded the video. It was called Lisa Home. News of this video quickly spread throughout the media, leaving many people stunned by the series of coincidences. Some people began to speculate that someone had predicted the murder, but in reality, it turned out to be much simpler. It appeared that someone had just changed the channel name and video title after Lisa's body was found. Either this person wanted to spark another conspiracy theory, or was just playing a cruel prank. Meanwhile, the police were doing everything in their power to find the killer as quickly as possible. At the time of Lisa's discovery, investigators had already brought in 2 brothers and a woman, and they all denied any involvement in the murder. They claimed that at the time of the abduction, they were at home, providing alibis for each other. According to their accounts, the older brother, Neregas, was asleep in his room while his wife was preparing dinner, and the younger brother was on the computer. Neregas also added that around 8 p.m., he woke up and went to the gas station where he bought pizza and cigarettes. The police were pretty skeptical of their alibis, as all 3 could have simply been covering for each other. They collected their DNA samples, but investigators still lacked any evidence directly linking any of them to the murder. However, this didn't last long. Forensic experts were working in the barn and on the farm, utilizing all available resources and manpower, and soon, their efforts paid off. In the barn there was a small office-like room. It had a large window overlooking the cafe. Upon examining this room, experts discovered 15 different traces of male semen on the walls and floor near this window. It appeared as if someone had stood there, watching the cafe employees, including Lisa, and satisfying themselves. These semen samples were immediately sent to the laboratory, and experts quickly extracted DNA profiles from them. All 15 semen traces matched the DNA of the older brother, 35-year-old Nargis. The same applied to the feces found in the barn. They also belonged to him. In the next room, which had previously been used for storing cow's milk, forensic experts noticed a pipe about 2 feet above the floor, covered in a thick layer of dust, except for a small strip. The size of this strip perfectly matched the rope used to strangle Lisa. Traces of blood were also found on this pipe, and the DNA analysis confirmed it belonged to Nargis. On the floor beneath the pipe, they discovered a piece of the same rope. Experts examined it and identified 2 DNA profiles, Lisa's and Nargis's. This was a significant breakthrough for the police. It finally linked the man to the rope used to kill the victim. Furthermore, a hair belonging to Lisa was found on the floor of this room. Another crucial piece of evidence came from her jacket. DNA traces belonging to Nargis were also found on it. Based on these evidence, the police believed that she was killed right there. They pieced together an approximate sequence of events. Nargis had been observing the Kaffa copyright for some time, and when Lisa was alone in the parking lot, he approached her. Based on the jogger's account, he could have asked Lisa for directions to a certain city, or used some other tactics. Then, Nargis might have asked her to get into his car to enter the route into the GPS system. Considering Lisa was kind-hearted and always tried to help others, she might have agreed. Once she was in the car, the perpetrator taped her mouth shut and drove her to the barn. There, he wrapped the rope around her neck and hung her from the pipe. According to the medical experts, this sight likely excited him so much that he defecated on the floor due to an adrenaline rush. When she died, he placed Lisa's body in the car and drove to the farm, tossing her belongings out the window along the way. There, he hid the body in the trailer locker, covering it with old clothes scattered around. All of this, from the moment of the abduction, took the perpetrator less than an hour. Despite all the evidence, Nargis continued to insist on his innocence. His wife and younger brother had to be released because there was nothing against them. Once free, they almost immediately left Sweden and returned to their homeland, Lithuania. The preparation for the trial was intense. Nargis claimed he had worked in that barn for a long time, suggesting his DNA could have been present there due to his job. Additionally, he had an alibi provided by his wife and brother. Although there were serious doubts about the credibility of both sources, in court this could have definitely worked in his favor. On the other hand, the presence of Nargis' DNA on the victim's clothing could only be explained by direct contact with her on the day of the murder. The police also found a witness who saw his car near the cafe shortly before and after Lisa's abduction. According to them, the car passed along the road between the cafe and the farm several times at the same time when Nargis was supposed to be sleeping at home, according to his brother and wife. For several months after the discovery of her body, experts continued to examine all the available evidence using the most advanced equipment. Eventually, they uncovered traces of Nargis' DNA on almost all of Lisa's clothing, including the inside of her underwear. Considering that the whole country was still following the case, investigators continued to search for any other useful clues that could impact the legal process and further prove Nargis' involvement. They even went to Lithuania to speak with his wife and brother once again. The woman continued to insist that he did not leave the house between 6 and 8 p.m., but when it was the younger brother's turn, detectives suddenly got what they wanted. After telling him about all the evidence against his brother and detailing what he did with the 17-year-old girl, the man decided to tell them everything. He claimed that Nargis actually was not at home that evening and only returned around 7:30 p.m. He was covered in dirt and immediately threw all his clothes into the washing machine. When the police started to question all the residents and reached their house, Nargis whispered to his brother, "Tell them I was home at that time." Later, Nargis explained that he was afraid he would be framed for a crime he didn't commit because he was an immigrant and had no alibi for the time of the abduction. The younger brother truly believed that his relative had nothing to do with it, but after hearing about all the evidence, he realized it wasn't the case. Lisa's funeral took place only a month after her murder. The church where it was held could only accommodate 130 people, but there were many more who came to say goodbye to her. Organizers even decided to set up benches and large screens outside, so that everyone could watch the ceremony. The trial began 4 months after the murder. This case once again captured the attention of the entire country, so everyone involved in the process was under tremendous pressure. None of them had the right to make a mistake. Nargis's lawyer insisted that his client's DNA could have ended up on the victim's clothing because he had worked in the barn. The prosecution, however, pointed out that this version made no sense, especially in the case of Lisa's underwear. The only way the suspect's DNA could have ended up there was if he touched the victim's underwear. The lawyer couldn't provide any other solid facts pointing on his client's innocence. At one point, he tried to push the version that the real murderer was Nargis's younger brother. According to this theory, the brother somehow took multiple samples of Nargis's DNA and placed them on the victim's body, as well as at the crime scene. However, the lawyer failed to explain the possibility of such manipulations with the DNA. The trial lasted for a month, and Nargis was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in a high-security prison. Given that this is Sweden we're talking about, the facility resembled more of a decent 3-star hotel. His lawyer attempted to appeal the verdict, but the appeal was rejected. In early 2017, Nargis himself applied for deportation and transfer to a prison in his homeland. The reasons for this decision were unknown. Lithuanian prisons are significantly worse than Swedish ones, yet the court decided to approve his request. After all, providing comfortable conditions of detention costs Swedish taxpayers several $100s per day for each individual inmate. Later that same year, his motives became clear. He appealed to Lithuanian court and his sentence was reduced from life to 15 years. However, the joy was short-lived for the murderer. A few weeks later, the court overturned his decision, and Nargis was once again destined to spend his entire life in prison. Only now, he had no chance of returning to the comfortable Swedish cell. 5 years later, in August 2022, Nargis faced yet another downside of being transferred to a Lithuanian prison. While inmates were being moved to another block, one of them attacked Nargis with a shank. He suffered serious injuries and died on the way to the hospital. As for his wife, the question of her involvement is still not entirely ruled out. Police noted that there is practically no chance of her direct involvement in the abduction or murder. In that case, experts would have found her DNA on Lisa's clothing or belongings. However, it cannot be ruled out that she knew of her husband's crime and helped him evade justice by providing a false alibi. Nargis' younger brother also raises questions. Kafka copyright employees reported seeing two men standing near the barn and watching them. Considering that one of them was likely Nargis himself, the second should have been his brother. However, the man's DNA was not found either in the barn itself or on Lisa's clothing, making his involvement in the murder unlikely. Perhaps they were indeed observing the young employees with the older brother and even discussing inappropriate things, but only Nargis decided to commit such a heinous crime. Alright guys, share your thoughts on this story in the comment section, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Ethan Reed, a dedicated teacher, was involved in a tragic crime story that drew significant attention. His relationship with Olivia Rogan, a software engineer, became entangled with issues of surveillance and control, leading to a heartbreaking conclusion. On October 15, 2021, police responded to a distress call from an apartment complex on Oak Street. What they discovered inside would haunt them for years to come. The lifeless body of 32-year-old Ethan Ray, a beloved local high school teacher, lying in a pool of his own blood. The suspect, his girlfriend of 2 years, 29-year-old software engineer Olivia Rogan, was a young woman with a bright future, known for her involvement in community activities and her academic achievements. As investigators delved deeper into the case, they uncovered a disturbing web of surveillance, manipulation, and escalating control that had ensnared Ethan in the months leading up to his death. Hidden cameras meticulously placed throughout his apartment told a silent tale of paranoia and obsession. Olivia Rogan's path to becoming the central figure in a tragic true crime story began long before she met Ethan Reed. Born in 1993 to Margaret and James Rogan, Olivia grew up in a middle-class suburb of Portland. From an early age, those close to the family noted Olivia's intense need for attention and validation. Margaret Rogan, in an interview following her daughter's arrest, reflected on Olivia's childhood. She was an exceptionally bright child, always at the top of her class, but she struggled to form lasting friendships. Margaret recalled, "At the time I thought it was just because she cared so much." Despite these interpersonal challenges, Olivia excelled academically. She graduated as valedictorian of her high school class and went on to study computer science at Stanford University. It was here that Olivia's controlling tendencies found a new outlet in the world of technology. Her college roommate, Sarah Jennings, remembered Olivia's fascination with coding and surveillance software. She was brilliant at it, Sarah said, but sometimes it felt like she was using her skills to keep tabs on everyone around her. She'd casually mention things about our classmates that she couldn't possibly have known without some kind of digital snooping. After graduating with honors, Olivia landed a prestigious job at a tech startup. Her colleagues described her as driven and meticulous, often working long hours to perfect her code. However, her personal life continued to be marked by tumultuous short-lived relationships. Jason Tran, who dated Olivia for 6 months in 2019, described the relationship as intense and suffocating. "She wanted to know everything about my day, my thoughts, my plans," he said. When I tried to set boundaries, she'd become angry or manipulative. It was exhausting. By the time Olivia moved back to Ashland in early 2020, accepting a remote position with her company, she had left a trail of broken relationships behind her. Yet those who knew her couldn't have predicted the dark turn her life would take when she met Ethan Reed. Ethan Reed's life stood in stark contrast to Olivia's tumultuous journey. Born in 1990 in Ashland, Ethan was the youngest of 3 children in a close-knit family. His older sister, Amanda Reed, described their childhood as idyllic. "We grew up surrounded by nature, spending our summers hiking in the mountains and our winters skiing." Ethan was always the peacemaker, the one who could make anyone laugh. From an early age, Ethan showed a passion for learning and a natural ability to connect with others. His high school English teacher, Mrs. Elaine Hoffman, remembered him fondly. Ethan had a way of bringing out the best in his classmates. He was patient, kind, and had an infectious enthusiasm for literature. "I always thought he'd make an excellent teacher someday." Mrs. Hoffman's prediction proved accurate. After graduating from the university with a degree in English literature, Ethan returned to his hometown to teach at Ashland High School. Ethan's personal life was characterized by steady, long-term relationships. His college girlfriend, Laura Simmons, remained a close friend even after their amicable breakup. "Ethan was always so balanced," she said. "He valued his independence, but was also incredibly loyal and supportive. We broke up because our career paths were taking us in different directions, but there was never any drama." The fateful meeting between Olivia Rogan and Ethan Reed occurred on a sunny Saturday afternoon in May 2020 at a local farmer's market. Olivia, still adjusting to life, had ventured out to explore her new surroundings. Ethan, a regular at the market, was picking up fresh produce for the week. Their eyes met across a display of organic apples, and Ethan, ever the friendly local, struck up a conversation about the best varieties for baking. Olivia, charmed by his easygoing nature and warm smile, found herself lingering at the stall far longer than she'd intended. As they chatted, they discovered a shared love of classic literature and hiking. Ethan, impressed by Olivia's quick wit and intelligence, suggested they meet up for a hike the following weekend. Olivia, feeling an instant connection, eagerly agreed. Their first date was a hike up to Grizzly Peak, offering breathtaking views of the Rogue Valley. Ethan's friend Mark later recalled, "Ethan came back from that hike on cloud 9. He couldn't stop talking about how smart and funny Olivia was. How they talked for hours without a lull in the conversation." Over the next few weeks, Olivia and Ethan's relationship blossomed rapidly. They spent long evenings discussing books, sharing meals, and exploring the natural beauty of southern area. To those around them, they seemed like a perfect match. However, even in these early honeymoon days of their relationship, there were subtle signs of Olivia's possessive nature. Ethan's sister, Amanda, noticed that Olivia seemed to monopolize his time. She'd call or text constantly when they weren't together, and she always seemed to have a reason why Ethan couldn't join family gatherings without her. Ethan, blinded by the excitement of new love, brushed off these early red flags. When his friend Mark expressed concern about the intensity of the relationship, Ethan laughed it off. "She's just excited about us," he said. "It'll calm down once we're more settled." Little did Ethan know that this was just the beginning of a pattern that would gradually tighten around him, slowly cutting him off from the life he had built and the people who cared about him most. By the fall of 2020, Olivia had all but moved into Ethan's apartment. Despite him never officially asking her to live with him, she began to exert influence over every aspect of his daily life, from what he ate to how he spent his free time. Ethan's colleague and friend, fellow English teacher Jessica Lawson, noticed changes in his behavior at work. He started turning down invitations to after-school happy hours, something he'd always enjoyed before. When I asked him about it, he said Olivia wasn't comfortable with him being out late, Jessica recalled. It seemed odd, given that she knew most of us and had even joined us a few times. Olivia's control extended to Ethan's social media presence. Friends noticed that his usually active Facebook and Instagram accounts became sparse, with posts becoming infrequent and impersonal. When questioned, Ethan would brush it off, saying he was trying to be more private online. But it was Olivia's attempts to isolate Ethan from his family that raised the most alarm bells. Amanda Reed remembered a particularly disturbing incident during the 2020 holiday season. We always have a big family Christmas at our parents' house, she said. But that year, Ethan called at the last minute to say he and Olivia couldn't make it. When I pressed him, he said Olivia wasn't feeling well, and he needed to stay with her. But I could hear her in the background, sounding perfectly fine. Olivia employed a variety of emotional manipulation tactics to maintain her grip on Ethan. She would oscillate between lavishing him with affection and subjecting him to cold, silent treatments if he didn't comply with her wishes. Ethan's friend Mark recounted a camping trip they had planned for months. The night before we were supposed to leave, Ethan called to cancel. He sounded so defeated. He said Olivia was upset he was going away without her, even though she'd been invited and had declined. As 2021 progressed, Olivia's behavior became more erratic. She began accusing Ethan of infidelity, despite having no evidence to support her claims. She would show up unannounced at the high school, ostensibly to bring Ethan lunch. But colleagues noted how she seemed to be scanning the room, as if looking for signs of inappropriate behavior. Ethan's student Emma Chen later testified to a disturbing encounter. Ms. Rogan came into our classroom during lunch break. Mr. Reed wasn't there, but she stayed anyway, asking us questions about him. It felt really weird and invasive. Despite the mounting evidence of Olivia's controlling behavior, Ethan remained committed to the relationship. Those close to him noted his increasing stress and anxiety, but he would deflect their concerns, often making excuses for Olivia's actions. His sister Amanda confronted him directly in the summer of 2021. I told him I was worried that this didn't seem like a healthy relationship, she said. But he just got defensive. He said I didn't understand Olivia, that she'd been hurt in the past and needed extra reassurance. He truly believed he could help her overcome her insecurities. As Olivia's paranoia and need for control reached new heights, she made a decision that would irreversibly alter the course of her relationship with Ethan, and ultimately lead to its tragic conclusion. In late August 2021, while Ethan was away at a weekend teaching conference, Olivia took the drastic step of installing hidden cameras throughout his apartment. The idea had been brewing in Olivia's mind for weeks. Her background in software engineering made the technical aspects of the plan feasible, and her growing suspicions about Ethan's fidelity provided the justification she needed to overcome any moral qualms. Olivia meticulously planned the operation, purchasing small high-definition cameras disguised as everyday objects, a smoke detector, a phone charger, even a potted plant. She also set up sophisticated software that would allow her to access the feeds remotely, from her laptop or phone. On the Friday afternoon that Ethan left for his conference, Olivia sprang into action. She had a key to his apartment, ostensibly for emergencies, which gave her unfettered access. Over the next several hours, she carefully placed cameras in the living room, kitchen, bedroom, and even the bathroom, ensuring every corner of Ethan's private space was under surveillance. With the cameras in place and the software running smoothly, Olivia left the apartment, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and guilt. She told herself that this was a necessary step, that it would allay her fears and allow her to trust Ethan completely. The first few days of monitoring proved uneventful. Olivia watched as Ethan went about his daily routines, grading papers, preparing lessons, chatting on the phone with his sister. But rather than easing her suspicions, the lack of incriminating evidence only fueled Olivia's paranoia. She began to obsess over minor details. Why did Ethan smile at that text message? Who was he waving to out the window? Olivia's colleague, David Cho, later recalled noticing changes in her behavior at work during this time. She seemed distracted, constantly checking her phone. I caught a glimpse of her screen once. It looked like a video feed, but she quickly closed it when she saw me looking. As the days turned into weeks, Olivia's obsession with the camera feeds grew. She began neglecting her work, her sleep suffered, and her interactions with Ethan became increasingly strained as she struggled to keep her secret. One evening, while reaching for a book on his shelf, Ethan noticed that several volumes were slightly out of place. He distinctly remembered organizing them just days before. In the bathroom, his toiletries seemed rearranged, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly how. More unsettling were the times he felt as if he was being watched. He'd be grading papers in the living room and suddenly feel a prickle on the back of his neck, as if someone's eyes were on him. But when he looked up, he was alone. Ethan's friend and fellow teacher, Jessica Lawson, recalled a conversation they had during this period. He mentioned feeling on edge in his own home, she said. He laughed it off, saying he was probably just stressed about work, but I could tell it was really bothering him. Olivia's behavior added to Ethan's growing discomfort. She began making comments about his daily activities that she shouldn't have known about. Once, she mentioned in passing that she liked the new brand of coffee he'd bought, despite not having been to his apartment in days. Another time, she asked about a phone call he'd had with his mother, though he was certain he hadn't mentioned it to her. When Ethan would express confusion about these slip-ups, Olivia would quickly change the subject or provide vague explanations. He must have mentioned the coffee in passing, she'd say, or perhaps his mother had told her about the call. As his unease grew, Ethan found himself second-guessing his own memories and perceptions. Am I just being paranoid? He wondered. Is the stress of work getting to me? Despite his attempts to rationalize the strange occurrences, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He began to pay closer attention to his surroundings, noting any changes or oddities in his apartment. He even considered confiding in his sister Amanda, but hesitated, worried that his suspicions might sound absurd or that he might be overreacting. The moment of revelation came on an October evening in 2021. Ethan had been grading papers late into the night, the soft glow of his laptop illuminating the living room. As he stretched and prepared to call it a night, his elbow knocked a small potted plant off the side table. The pot shattered on the hardwood floor, soil and ceramic shards scattering across the room. As Ethan knelt to clean up the mess, something caught his eye amidst the debris. A tiny lens no bigger than a pencil eraser glinted in the low light, his heart racing. Ethan carefully extracted the object from the soil. It was a miniature camera, expertly concealed within the plant's base. The discovery sent a chill down Ethan's spine. With trembling hands, he began a frantic search of his apartment. Over the next hour, he uncovered 5 more hidden cameras, in the smoke detector, a picture frame, even the shower head. The realization that his most private moments had been under surveillance was overwhelming. Ethan's mind reeled as he pieced together the implications. The strange comments Olivia had made, her uncanny knowledge of his daily activities, the feeling of being watched, it all suddenly made horrifying sense. The woman he had loved and trusted had violated his privacy in the most intimate way possible. In a daze, Ethan called the one person he knew he could trust implicitly, his sister Amanda. It was past midnight, but she answered on the second ring, immediately alert at the sound of distress in her brother's voice. "Ethan, what's wrong?" she asked, concern evident in her tone. Through a voice choked with emotion, Ethan recounted his discovery. Amanda listened in shocked silence, her initial disbelief quickly turning to anger on her brother's behalf. As Ethan's story unfolded, Amanda's protective instincts kicked in. "You need to get out of there," she insisted. "Pack a bag and come to my place. We'll figure this out together." But Ethan was torn. Part of him wanted to confront Olivia immediately, to demand answers and explanations. Another part was simply numb with betrayal, struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with someone capable of such a gross invasion of privacy. In the end, it was Amanda's steady voice that guided his next actions. "Document everything," she advised. "Take pictures of the cameras. Save any recordings you can find. We'll go to the police in the morning. We'll go to the police in the morning." As the first light of dawn broke over Ashland, Ethan sat on his couch, surrounded by the dismantled remains of Olivia's surveillance network. His phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. "Good morning, babe. Sleep well." The irony of her feigned normalcy was not lost on Ethan. With a deep breath, he typed out a response that would set in motion the final tragic act of their relationship. "We need to talk. Come over as soon as you can." The tension in Ethan's apartment was palpable as Olivia arrived later that morning. She entered with her usual smile, leaning in for a kiss, but froze when she saw Ethan's grim expression and the array of dismantled cameras on the coffee table. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then Olivia's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. "Ethan, I can explain." She began, her voice quavering, but Ethan, his voice low and controlled, cut her off. He spoke of trust betrayed, of the sanctity of privacy violated. With each word, Olivia seemed to shrink, her usual confidence evaporating in the face of her exposed deception. When Ethan finally fell silent, Olivia launched into a desperate justification of her actions. She spoke of her deep-seated insecurities, her fear of losing him, her conviction that if she could just prove to herself that he was faithful, she could finally relax into their relationship. Her words came out in a rush, pleading and explanatory. But Ethan remained unmoved. "I can't be with someone who would do this," he said firmly. "We're done, Olivia. I want you to leave." Olivia's demeanor changed in an instant. Her tears dried up, replaced by a cold, hard look. "You can't do this to me," she hissed. "We're perfect together. You're overreacting." As Ethan stood firm in his decision, Olivia's pleas turned to threats. She spoke of ruining his career, of telling his students and colleagues about embarrassing moments she'd captured on camera. When these threats failed to sway Ethan, she resorted to emotional manipulation, threatening self-harm if he left her. Throughout it all, Ethan remained resolute. Even as his heart broke at the sight of Olivia's desperation, he knew with a clarity that surprised him that there was no coming back from this betrayal. Finally, seeing that her words were having no effect, Olivia stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind her. Ethan sank onto the couch, emotionally exhausted. He thought the worst was over. He had no idea that Olivia's desperation was about to take a far more dangerous turn. The events of October 15, 2021, would forever be etched in the memories of Ashland's residents. The day began like any other, with no indication of the tragedy that would unfold. Ethan, emotionally drained from the confrontation with Olivia, had called in sick to work. He spent the morning talking with his sister Amanda, making plans to file a police report about the hidden cameras. As evening approached, he decided to take a walk to clear his head, leaving his phone behind to avoid any desperate messages from Olivia. It was during this absence that Olivia made her final, fatal return to Ethan's apartment. Neighbors would later report seeing her enter the building, her face set in a mask of determination. She used her key to let herself in, her mind racing with a mix of anger, desperation, and a twisted sense of righteous indignation. When Ethan returned home around 7 p.m., he found Olivia waiting for him in the darkened living room. The sight of her there, uninvited and unexpected, sent a jolt of fear through him. "Olivia, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice wary. Olivia's response was chilling in its calmness. "We're going to fix this, Ethan," she said. "You'll see that we belong together." What followed was a heated argument that quickly spiraled out of control. Olivia vacillated between pleading for another chance and lashing out with bitter accusations. Ethan, his patience exhausted, demanded that she leave immediately. It was then that Olivia's fragile control snapped. In a move that would shock even those who knew of her obsessive tendencies, she produced a kitchen knife she had taken from Ethan's own drawer. The next few moments were a blur of violence and terror. Ethan, caught off guard by the sudden escalation, tried to reason with Olivia, even as he backed away from the blade. But Olivia, beyond the reach of reason, lunged forward. In the struggle that ensued, Ethan's training as a former high school wrestler came into play. He managed to grapple with Olivia, trying to disarm her without causing harm. But in her frenzied state, Olivia's strength seemed superhuman. Neighbors would later report hearing shouts and the sound of breaking glass. One concerned by the commotion called 911, but help would arrive too late. By the time police broke down the door of Ethan's apartment, the tragic scene had already played out to its grim conclusion. They found Ethan on the floor with multiple stab wounds marking his body, the life already fading from his eyes. Olivia sat beside him, the bloody knife still clutched in her hand, her gaze vacant as she stared at what she had done. As paramedics rushed in, futilely attempting to save Ethan's life, Olivia offered no resistance when the police took her into custody. Her only words, repeated over and over like a mantra, were, "He was supposed to love me forever." The investigation, led by Detective Sarah Nguyen of the Ashland Police Department, quickly uncovered the full extent of Olivia's surveillance operation, revealing months of invasive monitoring. This digital trail, along with physical evidence from the crime scene and witness statements, painted a damning picture of obsession and premeditated violence. Ethan's family and friends were devastated. His sister Amanda in particular struggled with guilt. "I knew something was wrong," she said in a tearful interview. "I should have pushed harder, done more to get him away from her." As the investigation progressed, more details of Olivia's troubled past came to light. Former colleagues and ex-boyfriends came forward with stories of her controlling behavior and emotional manipulation. Her parents, shell-shocked by their daughter's actions, could only offer tearful apologies to Ethan's family. The district attorney presented a methodical case, walking the jury through the progression of Olivia's obsessive behavior. 3 covered surveillance footage played a central role, starkly illustrating the invasion of Ethan's privacy. The defense didn't contest the basic facts of the case. Instead, they focused on Olivia's mental state, bringing in expert witnesses to testify about her history of attachment issues and borderline personality disorder. They argued that Olivia's actions were the result of a mental health crisis, not premeditated murder. Olivia herself took the stand. Her testimony, an unsettling mixture of remorse and rationalization, she spoke of her deep love for Ethan and her fear of abandonment, claiming that she never meant to hurt him. Her apparent lack of full comprehension of the gravity of her actions left many in the courtroom disturbed. After a 2-week trial and 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on charges of first-degree murder. At the sentencing hearing, the judge delivered a scathing indictment of Olivia's actions before sentencing her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Ashlyn slowly healed, the community was left to reflect on the nature of love, trust in the human capacity for both compassion and cruelty. The case would be remembered, not just for its shocking conclusion, but as a catalyst for change and a somber reminder of the importance of recognizing and addressing toxic relationship dynamics before they escalate to tragedy. In the summer of 2019, 21-year-old Ollie Castile was a junior at the University of Mississippi, or Ole Miss as it's more commonly known. Ollie was smart, driven, and involved in tons of activities. Up until then, her time at Ole Miss was rewarding, fulfilling, and downright fun. But if there was a dark spot on her amazing college experience, it was her tumultuous on-again, off-again relationship with Brandon Thiesfeld. On the surface, Ollie and Brandon looked like the perfect couple. However, Ollie's friends didn't like Brandon, or the way he treated her. They urged her to leave him and find someone who would give her the respect she deserved. Sadly, she didn't take their advice, and the consequences were nothing short of tragic. Before we begin, we would like to express our sincere condolences to the Castile family for their loss. Alexandria Ollie Castile was born in St. Louis, Missouri, on September 11, 1997, and her bubbly and outgoing personality began taking shape almost immediately. Ollie always had lots of friends, and she was close with her parents Cindy and Keith and her younger brother Andrew as well. She had a relatively happy and uneventful childhood. As a teenager, she attended Lindbergh High School, where she cheered, ran track, and played on the golf team. Ollie also participated in student government, was a member of the National Honor Society, and was driven to serve those less fortunate than she was. As such, she traveled to Africa and South America to teach English to poor children in rural communities. In high school, Ollie and her friend Maddie Norris were so inseparable, they even went to the prom together. Most of Ollie's friends went on to in-state colleges and universities after graduation, but she had always dreamed of attending Ole Miss in Oxford, Mississippi. Ollie loved the school's rich history and its old-fashioned Southern charm. According to her mother, she was also a big fan of the school's top-notch football team, and more importantly, she thought it would be a great place to meet a future husband. With an academic record like Ollie's, getting into Ole Miss was never really in doubt. Ollie graduated from high school in the summer of 2016 and moved to Oxford the following fall. Right off the bat, she loved Old Mississippi. Her plan was to study business and marketing and work in the fashion industry when she graduated, but she wasn't about to spend the next 4 years living in a library. Ollie didn't waste any time making friends and getting involved in on and off-campus activities. Ollie got along with everyone. She was very bubbly and spirited. She always had a smile on her face. Ollie, what are you doing? Taking a picture for Sunsets by Ollie. Follow her. She first met Brandon Thiesfeld in the fall of 2016. He was from Fort Worth, Texas, and they were instantly attracted to each other. However, they were also polar opposites in many respects. Ollie was a popular go-getter with a positive attitude. She endeared herself to nearly everyone she met. But according to a fellow student who lived in the same dorm as Brandon, he was arrogant, conceited, spoiled, and even misogynistic. He said that Brandon often made offensive comments about women, and that he bragged about being from a rich family, and that his dad could get him off the hook no matter what kind of trouble he got into. It's not clear if Brandon behaved like this around Ollie, or whether she was just attracted to bad boys. But they did start dating almost immediately. They regularly attended parties and sorority and fraternity functions together, but according to Ollie's friends, they were never technically boyfriend and girlfriend. In fact, Ollie's friends didn't even like Brandon. Many a night, they were the ones who comforted her when he did or said something rude or insensitive, or just disappeared without letting her know where he was going or who he was with. At that point, Ollie's romantic life was a mess, but she studied hard, stayed active, and spent as much time with her friends as possible. By 2019, graduation was just a year away. Shortly before the end of the spring semester, her parents drove down from St. Louis to visit. They had such a great time together that Ollie asked them to stay for a few more days. She was in good spirits when they said goodbye and pulled out of Oxford, but behind the scenes, the tension between her and Brandon was about to reach epic proportions. On April 12, 2019, Ollie informed Brandon by text that she might be pregnant. She would have preferred to tell him in person, but by then they weren't dating. Brandon ignored the text, but 2 days later on the 14th, Ollie sent him a photo of an inconclusive home pregnancy test. Eventually, he replied with a text of his own, but it was not what Ollie was expecting. Brandon's message stated that she should terminate the pregnancy, that having a child would ruin his life, and that he wouldn't support the baby if she had it. At the end, he said he definitely wasn't going to change his mind. To a caring and nurturing person like Ollie, Brandon's message must have been crushing, and as the drama unfolded, he did a number of internet searches for things like morning after pills and local abortion services. Ollie stayed in Oxford when most of her friends, classmates, and sorority sisters went home for the summer. It's unclear why she stayed, but she may have wanted to get things worked out with Brandon once and for all. Whatever the case, he drove to Fort Worth for a few days in mid-July. On the way back, he posted a photo of a Glock Model 22, .40 caliber pistol that his father had bought for him. The caption said, "Finally taking my baby back to Oxford." Brandon arrived back in Oxford about 6:30 p.m. on the evening of Tuesday, July 16th. Later that evening, he scoured the internet for silencers and suppressors that would fit his Glock. He also did a number of internet searches for things like tactical face masks and hollow-point ammunition, and more surprisingly, he read up on the infamous American serial killer Ted Bundy. Cindy Castile called Ollie to see how she was doing on the evening of Friday, July 19, 2019. Ollie had just woken up from a nap after a long day on campus, and she told her mother that she was going out that evening. She met some friends at a bar in Oxford Square that night, but Brandon sent her a text around 9 p.m. Surprisingly, he asked if he could come to her apartment, and she agreed. She may have thought that he was finally ready to make amends, so she called an Uber to take her home just after 11:30 p.m. About 20 minutes later, a surveillance camera captured her leaving Oxford Square alone. Less than an hour later at 12:46 a.m., Brandon's Chevy pickup was captured by another surveillance camera traveling on West Oxford Loop near Ollie's apartment at the retreat. Then, at 1:14 a.m., it was seen traveling in the opposite direction on the same road. According to GPS data, Ollie and Brandon's phones were traveling together towards Sardis Lake, north of Oxford, between 1:14 and about 1:55 a.m. Between 2 and 2:15, someone reported hearing multiple gunshots near the lake. Later that morning, Brandon called a friend and asked if he could crash at his place, because according to him, there was an exterminator at his apartment. Brandon's apartment wasn't the site of bug killing, but he arrived at his friend's house around 10 a.m. Before leaving at around 1:30 p.m., he did a search on the internet for Sardis, Mississippi news. Long before sunrise on the morning of Saturday, July 20, 2019, a Lafayette County deputy was on routine patrol near Sardis Lake. The unpaved roads around the lake were dotted with dilapidated fishing cabins and dark stretches of forest. It looked like it was going to be yet another uneventful morning. That is, until he turned a blind corner and his headlights illuminated something more horrific than he had ever seen. Just a few yards away was the lifeless body of a young woman lying face down on the ground. She appeared to have suffered multiple gunshot wounds to her back. The ground around her was littered with spent shell casings, all of which came from a .40 caliber semi-automatic handgun. "You got there," What did you find? A white female laying on the ground with multiple gunshot wounds to her back. I have not worked a murder where somebody's been shot that many times. The deputy immediately radioed for an ambulance and a crime scene investigator. When the ambulance crew arrived, they found Allie's purse on the side of the road. Lafayette County investigator Jarrett Bundren arrived a few minutes later. He found Allie's driver's license and her University of Mississippi ID card inside her purse. Investigator Bundren was no rookie, but he had never seen a victim that had been shot so many times. He never found the deceased woman's phone, but by then he had more than enough to make a positive identification. Shortly thereafter, Cindy and Keith Castile experienced every parent's worst nightmare: the dreaded call from the police in the wee hours of the morning. "Hey Morgan, this is Wyka East. That's Lafayette County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling in regards to a friend of yours, Allie Hostel. The police came to the door, and they told us there had been a homicide and that she was the victim." As word spread, Allie's friends, family members and sorority sisters were shocked and horrified. Her high school friend, Maddie Norris, took the news particularly hard. Investigators began their hunt for the killer by contacting Allie's friends and acquaintances to see if they could shed any light on the brutal murder. Almost to a person, they mentioned one name, Brendan Thiesfeld. Investigators never recovered Allie's phone, but luckily many of the text messages between her and Brandon had synced to her Apple phone. They eventually got a hold of Brandon on the morning of Sunday, July 21st, and asked if he would come to the station so they could ask him a few questions. He said he was busy that day, but promised to come the following morning at 8:30 a.m. Investigators still weren't sure who had killed Allie, but Brendan was a person of interest from the very beginning. Needless to say, they weren't particularly surprised when he didn't show up at the station as he said he would. Because he was a potential flight risk, they were able to obtain an arrest warrant under exigent circumstances. This meant they could start tracking his cell phone, and lo and behold, Brendan appeared to be driving north on I-55 towards Memphis, Tennessee. They alerted other law enforcement agencies along the way to be on the lookout for his black Chevy pickup truck with the license plate TAK3IT. Coordinating with other departments on such a pressing matter was no easy task, and they worried that Brendan would eventually ditch his cell phone and disappear. Thankfully, officers of the Memphis Police Department's Fugitive Task Force sprang into action. They found and surrounded 22-year-old Brendan at a gas station just off the interstate and arrested him without incident. Inside his pickup, they recovered the .40 caliber semi-automatic Glock handgun. Brendan was extradited to Lafayette County, Mississippi just a few days after Allie's brutal murder, but investigators still had to prove that he had actually killed her. While he was in custody, investigators searched his apartment and found a bizarre letter he had written to his parents shortly before Allie was killed. Brendan never sent the letter, but he wanted his parents to know that he often had terrible thoughts that were intensified by cocaine and alcohol that he regularly consumed. The note also said that he thought the end was near, and that he would probably end up in jail or perhaps even dead. It's unclear if Brendan's reference to the end meant he was considering taking his own life. Another theory is that he may have envisioned a deadly shootout with police. Whatever the case, investigators found more circumstantial evidence while combing through his computer, cell phone, and social media accounts. GPS data showed that Brendan and Allie's cell phones were in nearly identical locations both before and after her death, but this didn't prove that Brendan had killed Allie. But it was strong circumstantial evidence because it seemed to indicate that he took her phone from the crime scene and either disposed of it or destroyed it on his way back to Oxford. Investigators also found a number of tasteless tweets and posts while searching through Brendan's social media accounts. One was even made on the same day of Allie's body being discovered. It made a thinly veiled reference to a 1982 hit, "You Dropped a Bomb on Me." To investigators, there was a clear parallel between the song and how he felt when Allie told him that she might be pregnant. Ironically, the medical examiner who performed her autopsy determined that she was never actually pregnant. The authorities were already convinced that Brendan had killed Allie, but the case got even stronger when the ballistic test confirmed that the bullets that had killed Allie had been fired from his Glock pistol. A Mississippi grand jury indicted Brendan Thiesfeld on a capital murder charge on August 20, 2019. Brendan was charged with capital murder instead of first-degree murder because, according to the indictment, he kidnapped Allie before murdering her. Despite the overwhelming evidence against Brandon, his father released a controversial statement to a Mississippi television station. He said that he knew Brandon was innocent and he asked the public to reserve judgment and presume that he was innocent until found guilty in a court of law. Allie's friends and family held a memorial in honor of her life, and to remember the impact she had on their lives. Her smile, her light will never be forgotten. Allie Costell's friends, they're making sure of that. The Ole Miss student from St. Louis was shot to death last weekend. There must have been more than 100 people tonight to honor her. Allie's friends say they appreciate the turnout, but Allie would have appreciated even more. There must have been more than 100 people at the vigil. Allie's friends say they appreciate that turnout, because there was nothing she loved more than having her friends together. It was emotional. There were lots of hugs and lots of tears. I may have been Allie's teacher, but clearly listening to everybody's thoughts tonight, she taught a lot of us as well. And I know our candles are burning, but Allie clearly is a light that's going to shine on in each and every one of you. She didn't deserve what happened to her. Nobody does, but she didn't especially. And I just want everyone to remember that. I want everyone to focus on how good of a person she was and how much joy she brought into the world and how positive she was, not the situation. Others took to social media to express the disgust they felt toward Brandon for allegedly committing such a gruesome and senseless murder. Brandon's trial was postponed for nearly 2 years because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Even so, he entered a not guilty plea on the capital murder charge, and his defense attorney initially asked that he be released on a reasonable bond. But before the judge could rule on the request, Brandon's attorney asked that he be kept in custody until a psychiatric evaluation could be performed. This may have been a legal maneuver in anticipation of a not guilty by reason of insanity plea, but Brandon was found to be sane and therefore competent to stand trial in late 2020. After lengthy negotiations between the prosecution and defense, the charge was changed from capital murder to first-degree murder in the summer of 2021. Brandon promptly pleaded guilty. Mandy, surely this murder case captivated people from St. Louis, where Allie's from, to Lafayette County, Mississippi, where she studied business at Ole Mississippi. After seemingly no movement in court because of COVID, now there's a guilty plea coming from her former classmate, Brandon Thiesfeld. Here's Thiesfeld's lawyer, Tony Fairs. It's been approved by the Costell family. The charge of capital murder for which Brandon was indicted will be reduced to that of first-degree or simple murder. Brandon Thiesfeld will be spared the death penalty in this plea deal. He'll now face a life sentence but does have the chance for release. What's available to him is not parole. It's called conditional release. After serving 15 years, and if you attain the age of 65, you may petition the sentencing court for release. As part of the new deal, Brandon would take the stand to lay out every detail of the crime he had committed. The Costells, the Thiesfeld, and a dozen of Allie's friends and sorority sisters were present during the trial. The atmosphere in the courtroom was understandably tense and emotional. Neither Brandon nor his attorney ever revealed a motive for the murder, but according to Lafayette County District Attorney Ben Creekmore, he killed Allie because he didn't want a child. This was a particularly heartbreaking moment for friends and family, because by then everyone knew she had never actually been pregnant. As heartbreaking as the proceedings were, the trial wasn't particularly tense or dramatic because he had already confessed and pled guilty to first-degree murder. As such, he was convicted and given a life sentence at the Mississippi State Penitentiary, or as it is more commonly known, Parchman Farm. However, there is still a chance that Brandon could get out of prison one day. In Mississippi, anyone convicted of first-degree murder may be released after serving 15 years, or when they become 65 years old. That said, there is no guarantee that he will ever be released and he may well die in prison. After the verdict was read, Brandon apologized to Cindy and Keith Costell for killing their daughter, and for the pain that he caused their family. He also said that he wished he could take it all back. He asked for God's forgiveness, and he hoped they would be able to forgive him as well one day. Afterward, statements from Allie's parents were read aloud by the Lafayette County Assistant District Attorney Mickey Millette. Cindy Costell's statement spoke of the undying love she shared with her daughter, and how Brandon had robbed them of all of their future memories. She also called Brandon an evil and sinister monster, and she hoped that he remembered the heinous crime every time his cell door slammed shut. Even now, Allie's parents admit they are still in denial. Keith Costell says that he still occasionally thinks that she's away at Old Miss, and it's just a matter of time before he will see her again. After their son was convicted, Brandon's parents released a statement. According to his mother, Carrie, she couldn't believe that her son was capable of such a crime when she heard that he was being questioned, nor did she or her husband have any idea that he had such emotional problems. In the end, they readily admitted that their son, Brandon, did kill Allie. To prevent a similar tragedy from affecting other families, she urged parents to talk to their children regularly, and to let them know that nothing was so big, complicated, or taboo that it couldn't be discussed openly. If you found this case compelling, don't forget to like the video, comment down below your take on it, and please subscribe to the channel. Also, hit the notification bell in order to stay up to date each time we reveal a new shocking case. Until next time, stay safe and keep your eyes peeled. You never know what's lurking in the shadows. Today we'll talk about the case of a 9.5-month pregnant woman who was attacked in her own apartment in the middle of the night. As the police began their investigation, they uncovered some very unexpected and chilling details. Eventually, they managed to unravel the truth in this complex case, but the ending was so shocking that even the detectives were stunned by those twists. Diana Diallo was born in 1959 in a quiet suburb city of Los Angeles called Tustin. Her dad was in the military and her mom worked at a small clothing factory. When Diana was 19, she met a guy named Kevin Green. She was at a bar with her friend when some men started bothering them. He was being too pushy, so Kevin decided to step in. After he made the guy go away, Diana offered to buy him a drink to say thanks. A few days later, they went on a date and things moved pretty fast from there. At the time, Kevin was already married, but he and his wife were in the process of getting divorced. Meanwhile, he and Diana moved in together and she got pregnant. As soon as Kevin's divorce was finalized, they got married the same day, eagerly awaiting the birth of their daughter. They rented an apartment in a small complex in Tustin. Kevin served in the Marines, working as a helicopter mechanic at the nearby base. Diana used to work with her mom at the clothing factory, but as her pregnancy progressed, she chose to stay at home and prepare for the arrival of their daughter. By the end of September 1979, Diana was 9.5 months pregnant, and she was due to go to the hospital any day now. On the evening of September 30th, after watching a movie together, Diana and her husband got into an argument. The stress of impending parenthood had been weighing on both of them, so they'd been fighting quite a bit lately. Kevin decided to take a drive to a nearby fast food joint to clear his head, and also avoid making the whole situation even worse. About 40 minutes later, a local police department received a chilling call. It was Kevin. He said that someone had shot his wife and she needed an ambulance as soon as possible. At that time, a patrol car was nearby and officers quickly arrived at the scene. Upon entering the apartment, they found Diana lying on the bed in her bedroom, covered in blood, seemingly from a head wound resembling a gunshot. The bedroom wall was also splattered with blood. Diana showed signs of life, trying to breathe, so the officers started performing first aid while they waited for the ambulance. They also asked Kevin to leave the room, as they were still unsure of what had happened. The medics soon arrived and carefully moved Diana into the ambulance. At first, they also thought she had a gunshot wound, but quickly realized it wasn't the case. The wound appeared to be caused by blunt force trauma. Kevin wanted to go with his wife, but the police didn't allow him to. They needed to take his statement, and at that moment they were considering all possible scenarios, including his involvement in the attack. Kevin was clearly in shock and seemed to struggle to comprehend the officers' words. He even attempted to get into the ambulance, so they had to stop him. As it drove away, he began to regain his composure and finally told the police what had happened that night. Kevin explained that he and his wife had an argument, so he decided to go to a fast food joint to get burgers and clear his head. When he left the apartment, he realized he had left his keys inside, but chose not to go back for them. He simply shut the door and headed to his car. Kevin also mentioned that not far from their apartment complex, he saw a van with its back door open, and there was an African-American man walking back and forth to it. Given that it was around 2 a.m., Kevin found it a bit unusual. He drove to his favorite fast food place, but there was a long line, so he went to another one of the same chain a few miles away. He bought some burgers and headed home, which took about 40 minutes. When he got to the front door, Kevin found it wide open. He rushed inside and heard strange sounds like someone snoring. Upon entering the bedroom, he saw Diana covered in blood, struggling to breathe, and immediately called the police. Some parts of Kevin's story immediately raised questions. For example, his decision to go for burgers in the middle of the night seemed odd. The whole trip also took him about 40 minutes, which was quite long considering that all the restaurants were close to his home. Nevertheless, officers inspected the fast food bag, and the food was still warm. The receipt contained the restaurant's address and the time of purchase, corroborating his account. Based on this, the police allowed Kevin to go to the hospital, but first they had asked him to provide a blood sample. DNA analysis wasn't available at the time, but experts could compare the blood traces found at the crime scene with Kevin's blood type. When Diana arrived at the hospital, doctors confirmed that the wound on her head wasn't from a gunshot. Most likely, the assailant used a small but heavy object, like a piece of wood, and inflicted a series of blows. At the hospital, Diana slipped into a coma. Doctors worked tirelessly for several hours to save both the woman and her unborn child. They eventually managed to stabilize Diana's condition, but she still needed surgery. Meanwhile, investigators requested medical experts to establish whether Diana had been sexually assaulted. Besides being standard procedure, Diana's positioning upon discovery prompted the officers to consider that possibility. The experts soon confirmed this version, discovering traces of semen on her body. However, there were a few complications. Kevin had informed detectives that they had been intimate a few hours before the argument that night, and DNA analysis was not yet available at that time, so even with a biological sample from the perpetrator, little could be done. Kevin and Diana's relatives spent the entire night at the hospital, hoping Diana and her baby could survive the attack. However, by morning something unexpected happened. One of the monitors detected a sharp deterioration in the baby's condition, and despite the extensive efforts of the doctors, the girl didn't survive. As for Diana, medics performed surgery immediately after the baby's death, and her condition was stabilized. She remained in a coma, but her chances of survival were now considered as high. However, doctors didn't expect her to return to a normal life after such serious trauma. Meanwhile, detectives worked tirelessly to track down the perpetrator who attacked Diana. After her baby passed away, the case was classified as a homicide, and the local police department put all their resources to it. Despite the fact that Kevin provided an alibi, detectives didn't rush to rule him out as a suspect. His story raised numerous questions. He had an argument with his wife just hours before the attack, left the front door unlocked, and was absent for an extended period for a supposed quick trip to the fast food joint. His claim of seeing a suspicious man near the house in the middle of the night also seemed too convenient, but there was no evidence against Kevin. Moreover, the police already had another suspect. About a year before these events, crimes with a similar modus operandi had started happening in Tustin and its surrounding areas. In December 1978, an unknown perpetrator broke into the apartment of a 17-year-old girl, struck her with a piece of wood, and stably assaulted her, resulting in her death. 4 months later, the same happened to a 21-year-old woman. Someone broke into her home and struck her with a piece of wood. She didn't survive either. In July 1979, the unknown perpetrator entered another woman's apartment and did the same to her, but she managed to survive. However, the victim spent several weeks in a coma due to her injuries, and her subsequent testimony didn't bring detectives closer to finding the attacker. In September 1979, less than a month before Diana's attack, the same happened to a 31-year-old woman who died the next day. Her son provided investigators with a description of the assailant, but the man still couldn't be identified. All these crimes shared striking similarities, just like the attack on Diana. Police were almost certain that they were dealing with a serial, and all their efforts were focused on catching this individual. He had already got a nickname, the Bedroom Basher. Considering that the perpetrator was committing his crimes with short intervals and operating in a relatively small suburban area of Los Angeles, detectives believed that he could strike again very soon. They decided to reach out to the public through the media and warn all women who lived alone, especially those in lower-floor apartments, as they were apparently the preferred targets of the suspected serial killer. This sparked a wave of panic. Women began clearing store shelves of any means of protection, signing up for self-defense courses, and staying with friends and relatives, trying to safeguard themselves from the dangerous criminal. Police also began patrolling the streets at nightfall. Detectives interviewed anyone who could have had any connection to these crimes, and soon they received their first leads. Several neighbors of the victims reported seeing a suspicious white man with dark, thick hair near their houses. Although this description was quite superficial, police located several matching men, investigated them, but it led nowhere. A week after Diana's attack, doctors informed her loved ones that she had finally regained consciousness. But there was a serious problem. Diana couldn't speak or remember anything, and according to the doctors, her brain needed some time to recover, functioning at the level of a 6-year-old child. Around the same time, another attack happened in Tustin. An unknown assailant broke into the apartment of a 24-year-old woman, struck her several times with a piece of wood, and sexually assaulted her. Tragically, the victim died, and the police once again failed to catch the culprit. Diana spent several more days in the hospital, and her mind began to gradually return to normal. However, she had almost completely lost her memory, and still couldn't recall even her parents. Doctors said her memory might eventually return, but warned her family not to recount anything to her, and to allow her to remember everything on her own. Once her life-threatening condition passed, Diana was discharged from the hospital, and her family took her home. Since Kevin needed to work on the military base to pay the bills, they moved in with Diana's parents, who could care for her around the clock. 2 weeks later, another tragic attack occurred in the city with a similar modus operandi, and this time, the unknown assailant killed a 17-year-old girl. After being discharged from the hospital, Diana started attending physiotherapy, and her condition gradually improved. She still couldn't speak or remember what happened to her, but everything suddenly changed 6 weeks after the attack. During a physiotherapy session, the therapist brought up the attack and asked if Diana still couldn't remember who did it to her. To the doctor's surprise, Diana suddenly nodded and pointed to her wedding ring. When Diana's mother came to pick her up, the doctor told her about this, and the mother asked her daughter, "Was it Kevin who attacked you?" And Diana nodded. Right after that, her mother took her to the police station, where she spoke with the lead detective. He asked Diana a few more questions, and she confirmed that she suddenly remembered the moment of the attack, and that perpetrator was none other than her husband. For the detective, this completely changed the course of the case. He and his team were almost certain that Diana was attacked by the same serial criminal responsible for the other similar attacks. But now the detective faced several questions. Could Kevin be the bedroom basher? He lived in the same area where the attacks happened, and even matched the description provided by several witnesses who saw a white man with dark hair. Or did Kevin decide to get rid of his wife by disguising himself as the active killer? Considering that all the actions of the bedroom basher were almost identical each single time, it wouldn't have been difficult. The detective thought that if he arrested Kevin now, his involvement in other crimes might never be proven, and Kevin himself could flee as soon as he realized he was caught. So he made a difficult decision. He asked Diana and her mother to pretend that Diana still remembered nothing and to return home to Kevin. This was obviously a huge challenge for both of them, but they agreed nonetheless. Investigators put Kevin under surveillance and closely monitored all his movements, hoping to eventually link him to other attacks. Police spoke with Kevin's friend to learn more about the suspect, and they quickly found out something interesting. Those who knew him well said that his relationship with Diana was quite tense. The couple argued frequently, a fact also confirmed by neighbors who often heard their screams. According to friends, Kevin regularly complained to them that Diana refused to be intimate with him in the final months of her pregnancy. Yet, Kevin had described his relationship with Diana to detectives as nearly perfect. But besides that, detectives couldn't gather any additional useful information. Kevin behaved quite normally. He went to work and came back home without lingering anywhere else and didn't raise any suspicions. The police also received results from the lab revealing an interesting discovery. Besides the attacker's semen, they found skin particles with blood under Diana's nails. Specialists matched the blood type of the attacker to Kevin's blood sample, and it matched. It meant that Kevin had the same blood type as the person who attacked Diana. Based on this information, detectives came up with the most likely version of what had happened on that fateful night. Kevin indeed bought burgers at a fast food joint a few miles from home. The time on the receipt and cashier's words confirmed his presence. So detectives believed he could have attacked Diana before leaving home, then quickly went to the fast food restaurant to create an alibi, explaining the extended 40-minute trip. Regarding motive, detectives theorized that Diana's refusal to engage in intimacy served as the trigger. Despite Kevin's claim that they had had sex hours before the incident, he frequently complained to friends about Diana's reluctance for months. Given the severity of the attack, detectives believe this was Kevin's breaking point. The police re-interviewed Diana, who confirmed she vividly remembered the attack and Kevin was indeed the one who assaulted her. During the conversation, her mother said they could no longer pretend and live under the same roof as Kevin. After that, detectives decided to arrest him and proceed with legal action. Kevin was taken into custody while he was at a store to avoid risking Diana's family and conducting the arrest at their home. Kevin refused to admit guilt, insisting that everything happened exactly as he had told them. Preparation for the trial took 10 months. During this time, Diana's physical condition gradually improved. She could speak again, although not without difficulty. Diana was also examined by several doctors who came to a unanimous conclusion that her brain had sufficiently recovered, and she was a reliable witness. Diana testified in court, confirming that the person who attacked her that night was indeed her husband. Kevin's defense insisted on his innocence, trying to use the fast food alibi, but it wasn't enough against the victim's testimony. In November 1980, Kevin was found guilty of killing his child and assaulting his wife. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Regarding Kevin's possible involvement in other murders and assaults, detectives noticed something interesting. Before Kevin's arrest, 2 more similar crimes occurred in their county, but both victims survived. They still hadn't been able to identify the attacker, so his identity remained unknown. But after Kevin's arrest, the attacks suddenly stopped. Before that, the bedroom basher committed his crimes quite frequently, sometimes with only a few weeks between them. But once Kevin was arrested, there were no more similar crimes at all. Right after the sentencing, Diana filed for divorce, and Kevin didn't try to object it. Since then, Diana continued to work on her recovery, but it was quite challenging considering the injuries she sustained. Her brain almost returned to normal, but some problems remained with her forever. She partially lost her hearing and vision and still struggled to speak. As for Kevin, he continued to insist on his innocence for years. His time in prison wasn't easy. Other inmates repeatedly attacked him for killing a child, and Kevin ended up in the hospital multiple times. When he had the opportunity to apply for parole, the commission denied it, and over the following years, he received 3 more denials. The main reason for these decisions was that Kevin had never admitted his guilt, which was seen as a lack of remorse. When DNA analysis became widely utilized in forensics, Kevin attempted to request analysis of the existing samples in comparison with his DNA, but this request was rejected due to the fact that he didn't have enough money to pay for the analysis. This went on until 1996, when the police department reopened the investigation into a series of attacks allegedly committed by the bedroom basher. Throughout this time, semen samples taken from the victims' bodies were stored in the laboratory. Now, detectives had the opportunity not only to determine if one person was behind all these crimes, but also possibly to identify them. Kevin remained the prime suspect, but when experts obtained the DNA profile of the perpetrator and added it to the database, there was an unexpected twist. All these samples matched another man named Gerald Parker. Parker was arrested in the same year as Kevin. He assaulted a 13-year-old girl in Tustin and was caught shortly after. At the time, detectives did not link this crime to the series of attacks because they had a different pattern. While the bedroom basher targeted victims late at night in their apartments, Parker abducted the girl on the street. Since then, he had been serving his sentence in prison and was set to be released in just a few days. After investigators obtained DNA matches for Parker in all the unsolved cases, they also remembered the attack on Diana. Although this crime was considered solved, detectives still considered its connection to the other similar cases highly likely. Now they understood that Kevin definitely wasn't the serial killer, leaving them with just one question. Did he really attack his wife? Interestingly, during those years, Parker served at the same military base as Kevin and also owned a dark-colored van. As we recall, on the very first day, Kevin told the police that he saw an African-American man in front of their house walking near a dark van. This made detectives wonder what if Parker was behind the attack on Diana. The local prosecutor visited Kevin in prison and informed him of the progress and the investigation of the Bedroom Basher murder series. He then asked Kevin to provide a direct sample of his DNA for analysis. Kevin, who had been trying to do this for years, immediately agreed. While experts conducted the analysis, detectives went to see Parker in prison. At that point, they hadn't yet charged him with the series of attacks because they needed time to prepare such a complex case. Nevertheless, the police decided to talk to the suspect, hoping he might give them a confession. Parker began to deny his involvement in the series of crimes, so detectives shifted the conversation to the attack on Diana. Before questioning him, they reviewed Parker's case and found something interesting. After his arrest for assaulting the girl, he told the police that military service was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Detectives decided to use this to their advantage and questioned how he could let another soldier take the blame for his crime. They continued pressing Parker, appealing to his loyalty to the military, until he suddenly said that another person was indeed serving time for the murder he committed. He continued admitting that on that night, he did indeed drive to Kevin's house in his van. His plan was to roam the neighborhood, peering into ground floor windows, as he had done many times before looking for his next victim. But this time he heard screams from Kevin and Diana's apartment, and a man came out onto the street. Parker noticed that he didn't lock the door, waited for a few minutes, then entered the apartment and assaulted Diana. He also said that he didn't know her husband since they had different duties on the military base. Parker also confessed to the other crimes, admitting to 6 murders and 3 non-lethal attacks. After the police obtained confessions, DNA results proved Parker's involvement in Kevin's innocence. The prosecutor promised to overturn his sentence as soon as possible, and a few days later, Kevin walked free after spending 16 years behind bars. The twist in this case caused a widespread outcry. It wasn't just because an innocent man spent nearly half his life for someone else's crime, but also because it took so long for the police to establish the real killer's identity. However, that wasn't the last twist in this case. When Kevin was released, the state of California agreed to pay him $10,000, which was a relatively small amount of money even for those times. Several years later, he got an additional compensation of $100 for each day spent in prison, totaling $620,000. But the story didn't end there. Despite Kevin's full exoneration, Diana refused to believe in his innocence. Up until that point, she had claimed Kevin was the only one who attacked her. However, after biological material from her body matched Parker's DNA, she came up with a new version. Diana claimed that on that night, Kevin attacked and assaulted her before leaving, and then Parker entered the apartment and did the same to her. Parker himself repeatedly stated that when he entered the apartment, the woman was simply lying on the bed without any visible injuries or signs of distress. He also claimed that he was the one who struck her on the head. Diana's family proposed another theory, suggesting that Kevin might have asked Parker to commit the crime, which is why he left the house that night, leaving the door open. But Parker continued to insist that he didn't know Kevin. There were numerous people on the military base, many of whom didn't know each other personally. Besides, such a version would imply that Kevin should have known Parker was the serial killer to ask him something like that, which he vehemently denied. Kevin also denied any connection with Parker, insisting he would never harm Diana, let alone their unborn daughter. He maintained that he left the door unlocked simply because he didn't want to return for the keys right after the argument with his wife. He also added that he still blames himself for that decision. Diana insists on her version of events to this day, and there could be a simple explanation for that. The trauma she endured as a result of the attack had a profound impact on her brain. When she emerged from the coma, doctors warned all her relatives not to tell her of what had happened. The reason was that at the time, her brain could accept any information as true, and she would believe such memories to be accurate and real. It's worth noting that even at the time of Kevin's release, 16 years after the incident, she continued to experience serious difficulties. For example, Diana struggled to process fast speech, indicating that the consequences of the trauma had an irreparable impact on her brain. It cannot be ruled out that the trauma is the primary reason for her conviction of Kevin's involvement. As for Parker, in 1999 he was sentenced to death, but this sentence has never been carried out. After many years of waiting in prison, California imposed a moratorium on executions, so Parker continues to serve his sentence behind bars to this day. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching. One cold December night in 1996, a 12-year-old girl went missing from her New Jersey home. Heavily pregnant and just weeks from her due date, nobody could understand why the young girl would leave home in the middle of the night, or why anybody would want to harm her. The case on the surface seems troubling enough, but digging deeper into the circumstances of the girl's life revealed even more concerning information, including a strict, cult-like church, an overbearing tyrant of an aunt, and several family members who seemed desperate to keep the truth hidden. On December 15, 1996, 12-year-old Selena Jeanette Mays attended church with her family. Later that evening, she ate ice cream with her loved ones at the shared home on Crestville Drive in Willingboro, New Jersey. Afterwards, at around 11 p.m., she put her dishes in the sink and kissed her family members goodnight before retreating to bed. Her family initially noted in the days before she vanished, nothing seemed amiss. Selena's mood was stable and her behavior was perfectly normal, but her stepmother, Yvette Mays, would later recall that Selena had said, "Thanks for everything," before heading to bed. In hindsight, she realized that this may have been the 12-year-old's way of saying goodbye. The following morning, Selena's 4-year-old stepsister, Nori Mays, was sent to wake her for breakfast. When she didn't respond, the little girl approached the bed and pulled back the covers, surprised to find pillows neatly arranged beneath the sheets, made to look like there was a figure sleeping beneath them. If Selena had gone voluntarily, she'd taken nothing with her. Her bag, prenatal vitamins and CD player had all been left behind. By all accounts, she'd left with the clothing on her back, a red coat and nothing more. Selena has never been seen or heard from again. She was reported missing a day later on December 17th, but it would be several more days before the police were informed that the 12-year-old they were looking for was heavily pregnant. At the time she went missing, Selena was 9 months pregnant. Her unborn baby was due around December 29th, just 2 weeks after she went missing. Her family stressed that it was vital that she be found, as she would likely need to deliver the baby by C-section. According to reports, the 12-year-old would not reveal the identity of the baby's father, though she allegedly told her father that her boyfriend was 16 years old and not a member of her church. It's possible she decided not to reveal his name because she knew he would get in trouble. The baby's father could be charged with rape since Selena was a child when she became pregnant. Selena's father, CJ, recalled that the 12-year-old had become upset when she learned that tests done on the baby could help identify the father. Some family members later theorized that Selena had left of her own volition in order to avoid the baby being tested, and thus revealing the identity of its parent. Despite the fact that Selena was just 12 and that having a baby so young was a huge risk for her health, her family objected to the idea of getting an abortion when she first discovered she was pregnant because of their religion. CJ was employed as an accountant and bookkeeper for the Gospel of Christ Ministry, a small Pentecostal church based in Mount Holly, New Jersey, where his sister, Sarita Smith, was the pastor and Selena was raised as a member. Selena was also homeschooled and instilled with strict religious values throughout her childhood, as were her cousins and step-siblings, while many of the adults worked at the church. The congregation reportedly consisted of around 50 to 60 members, many of them extended families. It was common practice in the church for members to live on church property in large groups. Selena herself lived with about 15 other people at her 4-bedroom Willingboro residence. The church was insular and sheltered. Children were not allowed to mingle with the outside world and gained all their knowledge about life from the carefully curated and deeply religious words approved by Sarita. In 1991, however, the Gospel of Christ was removed as a member church of Christ Gospel Ministries International in Jeffersonville, Indiana, after an investigation was done into its pastor, and it was found that Sarita ran the church with an authoritarian style. A spokesperson later stated that, quote, "Their philosophy of church leadership and her management of financial matters is incompatible with our philosophy and policies." Interestingly, the church also had numerous complaints from former members made against it during the 90s. Many claimed it was utilizing brainwashing techniques on its congregation. Some members of the church were physically, forcibly removed by family members who felt that they were in too deep. Sarita though shot back at these accusations by alleging that upset and angry former church members had kidnapped Selena and were hiding her from her family. According to the Burlington County Times, Sarita rarely spoke to the police following the disappearance of her niece. She also denied police requests that would allow them to search the church and the family home. Furthermore, a warrant to search Selena's family residence was denied after a judge ruled that the Mays could be considered victims. The family had reportedly alleged that the police had been biased against them during an earlier interview. CJ's side of the family, including Sarita, cooperated very little with police at the time, as did their church congregation. Sarita has since died, and after CJ passed away in 2019, the Mays moved out of the family home from which Selena disappeared. It's unclear where they now live. The church building where the Gospel of Christ ministry once was, has been abandoned for over 10 years. One resident of Willingboro recalled following Selena's disappearance, the entire town talked about it. Many parents warned their children to stay away from the church. Further accusations at the time of the disappearance came from Selena's mother's side of the family. Selena's mother, Lynn Marie Vital, died of a brain aneurysm in 1994. Following her death, her family attempted to gain custody of Selena, citing numerous incidents of drug and domestic abuse CJ had carried out against Lynn before her death. CJ, for his part, argued by this time that he had found faith and was a new man. He was ultimately given custody of his daughter, and the pair moved to Willingboro. After Selena went missing, her maternal relatives accused the Mays of hiding her. Meanwhile, the Mays accused the Vitale family of taking her back to Florida or Michigan, where they were originally from, as they still wanted custody of the young girl. Nori Mays, the 4-year-old stepsister of Selena, who discovered that she was missing, recalled that nobody talked about her 12-year-old stepsister after she vanished. When she was just 8, Nori began asking questions, but answers were often vague and evasive. When the media approached the family for comment, Selena would often stop members of the family from talking. Nori remembered that one time she was told that Selena was gone because Selena slept around, got pregnant and ran away. Later, in 2024, Nori spoke with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and discussed the tight grasp her aunt Selena had on the family. She stated that Selena ran the church like a cult, and that many of the family members involved in it were stuck with nowhere to go. Quote, Nori also claimed that she wants her to theory that she hopes is true, that Selena's mother, Lynn, before her death, organized for a woman to help the young girl escape the church and move her somewhere where she would never be found. In the weeks following Selena's disappearance, the police issued flyers, spoke with the local community, and combed through nearby areas for any clues that would lead them to the 12-year-old. Around the time of her due date, they began contacting hospitals, hoping the young girl had been admitted and was giving birth in the care of professionals. But nobody had seen Selena, and her whereabouts remained unknown. On January 25, 1997, the owner of a Sizzlers restaurant in Howell told police that he believed he'd seen Selena dining as part of a group. He described her as no longer being pregnant, and said that she was in the company of several people, including a pastor and a photographer. Although initially this seemed like a promising lead, the police eventually determined that the girl seen by the restaurant owner was not Selena. Over 250 leads have swung up over the years, but none have panned out. Some of Selena's family members believe it is very unlikely that she is still alive. Her maternal aunt, Cindy Cram, told the Burlington County Times, an aunt of Selena's believed that the father of her child was an unidentified individual the young girl had met while out skating in Camden County, New Jersey, though this seems odd given that Selena's life was sheltered and controlled. It is difficult to think when she would have the time unsupervised to spend with a boy or a man. Rumors swelled at the time that one of Selena's own cousins, Sean Smith, the 21-year-old son of Sarita, was responsible for abusing and impregnating her. He was reportedly interviewed multiple times after the disappearance, but denied knowing where she was or being involved in her disappearance. A girl who was just a few years older than Selena at the time of her disappearance recalled that she had been repeatedly sexually assaulted by Sean as a minor and claimed that Selena confessed the same thing had happened to her shortly before she fell pregnant. Furthermore, in 1998, Sean was arrested after sexually assaulting 2 girls from the ages of 13 and 14. The assaults began in 92 and 93 respectively. He ultimately fathered 7 children by 4 different women, most of whom were church members. Unfortunately, Sean is now deceased, having passed away in 2020 at the age of 46, which leaves many questions unanswered. To this day, the identity of the father of Selena's child is still unknown, as is what happened to the baby and Selena herself following her disappearance. One relative suggested that the baby's father killed her to stop his identity from being discovered. Another speculated that she was the victim of an amateur abortion gone wrong. Over the last several decades, Selena's case file has often switched hands between detectives. Willingboro detective Monica Pogozelski has said that the police remain determined to see the case through. Quote, in 2021, the Willingboro Police Department revealed a renewed effort to solve the case, noting, social media has evolved greatly and can now reach a wide variety of people quickly through many platforms. We are using social media to distribute information about Selena, to raise awareness of her case. We are hopeful that social media will be a beneficial tool in finding new information about the disappearance of Selena Mays. In the years since she went missing, there have been several sightings of Selena in locations such as Lacey Township and Hopewell Township, both in New Jersey, but they have never been confirmed. Following her death, Selena's mother, Lynn, left her a large life insurance policy which she will now be more than old enough to collect if she is still alive. 12-year-old Selena Jeanette Mays was last seen on the evening of December 15, 1996 at her home in Crestview Drive in Willingboro, New Jersey. She is described as a mixed-race girl who is half African-American and half white with brown eyes and long black curly hair. At the time of her disappearance, she was 5 foot tall, around 120 pounds and also heavily pregnant. She was possibly wearing a long red coat when she went missing, as this item of clothing was gone from her room. If Selena is still alive, she will be 40 years old and her baby will be 27. If you have any information about Selena's case, you can contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-843-5678. Alternatively, you can call the Willingboro Police Department at 609-877-3001.
The students and families of this primary school had no idea that one of their teachers, who was known to be a kind-hearted and generous woman, was actually a cold-blooded murderer with an alter ego named Tulip 22. And this story highlights the depraved actions which she hid from the world for several months. Fiona Beale was described as one of the best. Her students trusted her, her colleagues supported her, and her partner adored her. It's just a shame that she would take his life in the most betraying of ways. The thing is, nobody suspected her involvement when he suddenly disappeared. It was only after sending a flurry of concerning text messages that officers finally connected the dots. And after tracking her down to a small cabin in the heart of the British countryside, they realized that she, in fact, was his killer. But what was her primary motive? How did she murder Nick Billingham? And who is Tulip 22? Fiona Beale was convicted of murdering her partner, Nicholas Billingham, in November 2021. Beale, a primary school teacher in Northampton, England, stabbed Billingham multiple times and then concealed his body in their garden shed. After the murder, she continued to live in their home and maintain the appearance of normalcy, even sending messages from Billingham's phone to make it seem as though he was still alive. The police discovered Billingham's body in March 2022, following an investigation triggered by concerns from friends and family about his sudden disappearance. Beale was arrested and subsequently charged with murder. During the trial, Beale claimed that she had acted in self-defense, but the jury found her guilty of premeditated murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. This is the case of Fiona Beale. Today, we're heading to a charming town in the heart of England, and of course I'm talking about Northampton. Famous for its shoemaking, the town boasts its heritage to shoemakers like Trickers and Crockett's and Jones. Apparently, it is said that at one point in time, you couldn't throw a stone without hitting a cobbler hard at work. But beyond the leather and laces, did you know that Northampton is home to one of the oldest markets in the country? The Northampton market dates back more than 800 years, well before the likes of Amazon and eBay. And as for its market square, well, it has seen everything from modern-day farmers' markets to justs. And speaking of history, Northampton Castle once stood proudly here, serving as a significant stronghold during the Norman era. That aside, Northampton also boasts the stunning Althorpe House, the childhood home of Princess Diana, and is home to the current Premiership rugby champions, the Northampton Saints. If you ever find yourself wandering through its cobblestone streets, then be sure to check out sites like the beautiful Guildhall and Abbey. Now, it may all just look like a typical British city. However, with hundreds of years' worth of history here, you will find plenty to do. But on March 19, 2022, a chilling new entry was written into Northampton's diary. Because, sadly, that is when the partially mummified body of a 42-year-old male was found. He was discovered in a makeshift grave in the garden of a house on Moore Street. Officers exposed to the body were forced with a terrible sight. A postmortem on the man's decaying body determined that the cause of his death was a stab wound to the right-hand side of his neck, splitting the right jugular vein and piercing the esophagus and trachea. With an entry width of 3.7 centimeters and a depth of 6 centimeters, this would have had to be executed with quite some force. And if it wasn't obvious already, it was determined that he had likely become the victim of a gruesome homicide. After careful analysis, the body was eventually confirmed to belong to a local man named Nicholas Billingham. Nicholas hadn't been seen since November the year prior, marking 4 months since his disappearance. Of course, family and friends were devastated to hear the news, only comforted by the fact that he no longer remained missing. But who precisely was Nick Billingham? How did his body end up buried in the home of his own back garden? And despite this proximity, how did he remain missing for 4 entire months? Well, before we answer these questions, let's first dive back to his childhood and learn how he ended up here. Born in the year 1979, Nicholas was the first child of Yvonne Valentine and his father. Sadly, not much is known about Nick's childhood, so I can't report much on his background. However, his mother would say that he was a loving child with a very cheeky smile, one who was loved by his friends and family, and as he entered his adult years, was loved by his colleagues too. Nick went on to work as a builder in the Northampton area, where he soon met the future mother of his child, Andrea Fardin. Without marriage, their on and off relationship resulted in the birth of their son in the year 2019. Andrea would later describe Nick as a bit of a lad, but not a bad person. He was the sort of guy who tried to keep everybody happy. In addition to this, Nick had been in a relationship for the last 17 years with a woman named Fiona Beale, and this woman is extraordinarily important to our case today, so take note here. At the time of Nick's death and discovery, Fiona Beale was 49 years old. She was a highly respected primary school teacher who worked at Northampton's Eastfield Academy, a primary school providing education for students between the ages of 2 and 11 years old. Fiona was well known to students and their families. She was trusted to look after their children and was described as a kind and caring woman. Claire Mills, who was the head teacher of Eastfield Academy, met Fiona in the year 2014 when they began to work together at King's Heath Academy. She described Fiona as a strong and very capable teacher, one who was one of the very best in the area. Her strength as a teacher was building relationships with children who needed additional support in time, suggesting that Fiona was actually the compassionate and patient type of person. Fiona thoroughly loved her job, as seen in this video with her dancing in front of her students. So, when she suddenly failed to show up to work one day on November 1st, 2021, her absence was strongly noticed, an absence that would extend for more than 10 days afterwards. It was learned that in the months leading up to Nick's disappearance, both he and Fiona had been undergoing couples counseling for a multitude of reasons. Now, Fiona had her own fair share of shortcomings, but as for Nick, well, he had just admitted to having an affair with another woman, and this was sure to leave Fiona devastated. Now, for some, affairs are enough to absolutely terminate a relationship, while others try to fix the bond that they once had. It was during this time that Nick wrote about Fiona as kind-hearted, generous, and the most beautiful woman in the world. and he seemed to have genuine remorse for his actions. He went on to say now, their relationship always had problems. However, it does seem that time slowly eroded their bond. When COVID struck, they were furloughed and confined to their home, where petty arguments would often erupt into fights. There seemed to be issues around sex and money, and basically everything in between. But despite this, the two did try to make things work. Tragically, if only Nick knew what was right around the corner. November 1st, 2021. It was a Monday, and relatively mild for a winter's day. After working on a house renovation in Northampton, Nick returned to the home he shared with Fiona on Moore Street. Fiona, on the other hand, was apparently signed off work sick. Allegedly, she had contracted COVID, meaning that she was restricted from attending school for the next 10 days. Instead, she spent most of her day at home smoking a large amount of cannabis, and as for her evening, she had grand plans on her mind. After returning home, Nick was lured into the bathroom by his girlfriend. Fiona had prepared a hot bath for him, with the promise of sex after he had cleaned himself up and relaxed a little bit. Unfortunately, little did he know that her motives were far from loving. Shrouded in deceit and darkness, Fiona concealed a knife in her dressing gown pocket, and once he was in the bath, she placed this knife in a drawer next to the bed that they shared, along with a chisel, a bin bag, and dozens of cable ties. Fiona then draped herself on the bed, waiting for Nick to finish his bath, and after he entered the bedroom, she then convinced him to slip on an eye mask. She told him that she was feeling rather kinky that evening and wanted to tie him up to the bed. And so, being a typical guy, that is precisely what happened. Nick liked where this was going. He gladly put the mask on and allowed her to secure his wrists to the bed frame. However, that is when the promising scene turned into a painful and confusing nightmare. Blinded by the eye mask, Nick was then suddenly struck in the neck with a knife. Fiona had shanked him with cold precision, severing his jugular vein in a single deadly blow. The pain that Nick would have experienced would have been absolutely enormous, and in a shocked and suffocating voice, he muttered the word, "Why?" In her deluded mind, Fiona responded by saying that she would never let him hurt another woman again. Just moments later, his life faded away underneath her. Following his death, Fiona decided to wrap Nick's body in a plastic sheet. But with him weighing a fair amount more than she did, this would take a considerable amount of time to complete. After that, she then proceeded to drag his body down the stairs, damaging the banisters in the process. And once downstairs, she carried his body into the garden, placing him in an area which was not too visible to the neighbors. Rather inconveniently, the neighbors were undergoing several renovations at the time, meaning that both Fiona and Nick had less privacy in their garden. She then proceeded to dig what can only be described as a makeshift grave. This rather grim burial site was made of several materials, including plastic sheets, badly mixed concrete, breeze blocks, and compost. But Fiona would not stop there, because she unfortunately had to add more material in order to fill up the hole she created. So that is when she went to the local store. Soon enough, Fiona was spotted on CCTV at a local B&Q, buying 10 50-liter bags of compost, 10 22.5 kilograms bags of Cotswold stone, and a gray plastic trough. Fiona did not have to worry about the time constraints here. She had meticulously planned this by forging a fake COVID test for school, meaning that she was forced to take 10 days off of work. After burying Nick's body, she then painted over his blood splatters which were left all over the bedroom. She then rearranged furniture in the living room to block off and obscure the view of his grave, and even went as far as burning Nick's belongings in an incinerator in the garden. Nick's blood had seeped into the mattress during the murder, so Fiona concealed this by carelessly hiding it in the basement. She then further checked that no other items or evidence were left behind in the gruesome aftermath, and with that said, she felt confident that no one would find out how he had died. That is when she began her efforts to conceal his fate from all who knew him, because as you can imagine, it didn't take long for Nick's family or friends to wonder where he had gone. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, his body remained undiscovered, all despite being morbidly close to the house that he once loved and called home. It was during this time that Fiona painted an entirely different perspective to the situation. In fact, despite being a cold-blooded murderer, she would make herself out to be the victim. She claimed that not only was he alive and well, but furthermore, he had actually left her for another woman, and given his recent history, this story was not too difficult to believe. It was during this time that she sent messages from his phone to friends and family, pretending to be him and creating the illusion he was okay. And to add to her sick and deceitful nature, Fiona herself would invite his very own mother around for drinks, telling her stories while his decomposing body lay only a few meters away. Fiona would eventually return to work on November 12th. While there, she confided in Claire Mills and told her that, apparently, Nick had left her for another woman. She further explained that Nick had become, quote, particularly unpleasant, and so she told property and never come back. She told another colleague that she wanted to buy Nick out of the mortgage, but apparently, he tried to keep the house in both of their names. Interestingly enough, her colleague would also say how keen Fiona was to get back to work, and how she appeared to be, quote, just the same as before. On December 10th, more than 1 month after his disappearance, the teachers of Eastfield Academy went to Lumbertub's pub in Boothville to celebrate Christmas. While there, Fiona was described as being jolly and thoroughly enjoying herself throughout the entire evening. 2 months later, on February 24, 2022, she was described as being upbeat as she took her class on a school trip to the Royal Opera House in London. Nobody noticed anything different until a few days later, when, all of a sudden, she stopped coming into work. That is when, on March 8, 2022, she sent the head teacher, Claire Mills, the following text message. Her message to Claire seemed to concern her quite significantly, and so, with fear and curiosity, she urged Fiona to get in touch with her so the two could talk about it. However, Fiona failed to reply. Instead, she fell silent. But Claire was not going to give up that easily. Instead, she called Fiona's mother, who seemed to be somewhat surprised to hear from her. You see, Fiona had given her mom an entirely different story. She told her that she had been asked to go on a residential course due to staff illness. So, when Claire informed her that this wasn't the case, both of them knew that something was up. And so, concerned for her well-being, the two confronted her about her inconsistencies. That is when Fiona responded with, I am sorry, I won't be back. I need more time and space to think. I'm sorry for letting you down. With this information at hand, Claire decided to contact the local authorities. That is when the officers were instructed to perform a welfare check at the property. But after reaching the home that she shared with Nick, they were met with silence. It became clear that, whatever was happening, they needed to act fast. Her mental health seemed to be deteriorating, evident through the worrying messages and fabricated stories sent to family and colleagues. And so, with that said, they got to work on tracking her down. It wasn't until March the 15th that officers finally tracked her down. Fiona had holed herself up in a holiday home over in Cumbria, and that is where she tried to take her own life. However, after failing to leave this world on her own terms, she was instead transported to the local hospital, where she sought immediate medical treatment. And this is where our story takes a rather bizarre turn, because after performing a search on the cabin, detectives found an extremely concerning journal. It was within this journal that Fiona revealed her deepest and darkest secrets, not only confessing her crimes, but also revealing her weird dark alter ego, also known as Tulip 22. In this journal, she said the following. I have to confess. Okay, here goes. He spat on me and threatened me during sex. The things he said and did fueled my dark side. I call her Tulip 22. She's reckless, fearless, and efficient. Ruthless. I started plotting as Tulip 22 after he had gone to bed. I could no longer sleep in the bed due to my breathing being so loud. Or I moved too much, or I was snoring, or etc., etc. I would go downstairs after sex, and even when I was unwell. I got used to sleeping downstairs, and waited for him to go to bed, and then got high and let Tulip 22 out. I knew I couldn't let him get away with it. Halloween sealed it. He was vile. I sat on the kitchen floor and wept as I witnessed the abuse I had allowed to happen. I allowed so much bad to happen. That night, I planned. COVID rules meant I had a guaranteed 10-day isolation period from positive symptoms. I called Claire on the Monday and said we'd tested positive and had symptoms. He went to work. Tulip 22 smoked and planned. I planned it mentally so many times before. November 1st, I had smoked all day. I had a bath. I left the water in. He had been pushing for sex. I encouraged the bath with the incentive of sex afterwards. While he was in the bath, I kept the knife in my dressing gown pocket and then hid it in the drawer next to the bed. I brought a chisel, bin bag, and cable ties up too. I got him to wear an eye mask. It was harder than I thought it would be. Hiding his body was bad. Moving a body is much more difficult than it looks on TV. I started to believe the cover story. Flashes interrupted. Now, I don't know about you, but for a teacher, Fiona could have done a much better job at constructing a coherent story with better English. Needless to say, these journals were extraordinarily concerning for officers, and they triggered detectives to conduct a more extensive investigation back at her property. The fact that Nick had not been seen for multiple months and was now the subject of her dark confessions left plenty of room for the imagination. And following this discovery, they of course requested a search warrant for the address. After arriving, they noticed the oddly placed furniture obstructing the back garden door, and after making their way into the garden, they noticed the unusually placed rocks and earth. Officers decided to check what was underneath. Armed with a forensic team, they carefully lifted the recently settled earth and rocks, and tragically, that is when they found his partially mummified body. And with Nick finally found, all eyes were now on Fiona. With Fiona in hospital, she was arrested as soon as she was deemed fit to be discharged, and several months later, her trial would begin on March the 13th, 2023. That is where, at Northampton Crown Court, with Judge Adrian Luckencasey presiding, her case began. Taking the middle ground, Fiona initially pleaded guilty to the less serious offense of manslaughter by reason of a loss of control. However, she would stop and deny her more severe charge of murdering Nick Billingham. Fiona's trial was extraordinarily long and fraught with bureaucratic issues. In fact, after 64 days, her trial was abandoned when it emerged that the key defense witness. Once again, Fiona denied murdering Nick, instead claiming it was manslaughter. However, after learning that the evidence mounting up against her was simply far too significant to overcome, she eventually pleaded guilty to murder on April 26, 2024. Upon her sentencing, Judge Mark Lucraft said, "You now accept through your plea that not only did you kill Nick Billingham, but that you intended to do so too. There is a wealth of evidence demonstrating your plans to kill him, taking elaborate steps to hide his body, and then, having done so, going to great lengths seeking to make sure that what you had done would not easily be uncovered. In my judgment, the sentence is one of life imprisonment." While receiving the sentence, Fiona hung her head in shame. Her representative explained how she had suffered traumatic amnesia following the incident, and that she also did express remorse in her journal entries. But Fiona would not let her trial end without making herself out to be the victim, one who was torn apart by a man who supposedly ruined her. While in court, she read out the following. It is worth noting here that Fiona merely claims Nick's questionable behavior, with no significant evidence or weighting to her allegations. Furthermore, there are no witnesses to support her claims, and she never reported his behavior to the police before his death. It is likely that Fiona is still refusing to take full accountability for her actions and is trying to soften the damage done to her reputation by claiming that he was partially to blame. While on the discussion of allegations, Fiona created an evil web of lies and deceit in order to preserve her own reputation in front of her own family and friends, all while simultaneously portraying Nick in a bad light to his loved ones. She further burned all of his possessions, essentially eradicating his entire existence from his mother's life. To further disrespect his death, Fiona disposed of Nick with supplies that were purchased with his own money, and if that wasn't enough, she even went on to purchase a vibrator with his own cash. It is obvious that, despite her timid facade, she was actually a wolf in sheep's clothing, and with that said, Fiona Beale was officially sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 20 years before she is eligible for parole. Following her sentencing, Nick's mother, Yvonne Ballantyne, read a heartfelt statement to the public, and with Fiona's case attracting nationwide attention, this was broadcast on multiple news sites. So, I think it's rather important here to acknowledge Fiona's emotions to better understand where her depraved actions came from. Fiona was in a relationship with Nick for more than 2 entire decades, and although the relationship was rather patchy, there is a formidable amount of love, support, comfort, and emotion between these two people. It must have been extraordinarily difficult for Fiona to realize that Nick had fathered a child with another woman, and for that, some empathy must be felt. However, that is where the line should have been drawn, because Fiona should have responded to this situation with compassion for herself, rather than revenge. To take matters into her own hands and end another person's life is, quite honestly, unforgivable, no matter what the circumstances are and the emotions felt at the time. Furthermore, for her to decide to murder Nick in the manner that she chose is, quite honestly, absolutely barbaric, and through the promise of closeness and intimacy, she murdered him in a way that guaranteed both pain and suffering. There was nothing that Nick could have done to prevent his death. By the time he realized he was in trouble, it was sadly all too late. Being restrained and blinded, there was no possible way he could have seen this coming, especially from someone he loved and trusted. Nick Billingham was taken long before his time. And although nobody claims that he was perfect, he was still a generous and caring man who made friends everywhere he went. He was known for being the glue that kept everyone together, and now, thanks to his cold-hearted killer, he is forever lost to the world. His mother will never get to hug her son again, his sister will never have the opportunity to talk to her brother, and his son will grow up without a father. So, I think I'm going to wrap this case up here today, folks. I think that pretty much covers the story of Fiona Beale. Before you go, though, I'd love to know what you think about this story. Was this manslaughter or cold-blooded, calculated murder? And did Fiona receive the sentence she deserved? As always, let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I also wanted to say thank you so much for your patience in the recent weeks with the reduced schedule. It's not a moment of rives, though. Remember to look after yourself, look after each other, and of course, stay safe. Thank you and goodbye.